The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the day Margaret Hale burned the last thing her husband had ever given her. It was not a sentimental act. The object was a promissory note for $412, signed in the flowing hand of a man 3 months in the ground, and the creditor who had delivered it that morning had smiled the particular smile of a man who believed a widow's grief was a leverage point rather than a wound. He was a compact man with a face like a boot heel and a voice that dropped half a register when he said the word arrears, as though the sound of it gave him physical satisfaction. He had sat in her kitchen and placed the note on her table with the deliberation of a man placing a trump card, and he had looked at her across the scrub pine with the expectation of a man who deals in vulnerability as a commodity and has found the commodity reliably available. She had shown him out. She had said 3 things, none of them involving the word please, and when he was through the door and down the front steps, she had shut the door behind him with the quiet click of someone who has decided something irrevocable. She had gone to the kitchen stove. She had lifted the grate. She had fed the note into the fire and watched the edges curl to brown and then to black, and then the whole thing go to orange and then to nothing. And when the ash settled, she had felt not relief, but the particular hollow calm of a woman who has run out of things to burn. The letter from Colorado arrived that same afternoon. A boy from the post office had brought it himself, which meant it was marked urgent, which meant someone, somewhere needed something quickly enough to spend extra on it. Margaret dried her hands on her apron and broke the seal at the kitchen table. The autumn light of 1888 falling through a window she had not washed in 2 months because there were approximately 47 things that needed doing before window washing, and she had worked through about 30 of them. The offer was plain and unapologetic, written on good paper in a hand that was steady and slightly old-fashioned. Silver Creek Ranch, Montrose County, Colorado, required a ranch manager with experience in livestock accounting, feed inventory, and general frontier operations. The owner, one Walter Harding, was 68 years old and in declining health. His sons were cattlemen, not administrators. The books were, by his own admission, in a condition he described as discouragingly poor, which she suspected was a considerable understatement from a man who had chosen that particular word to mean something considerably worse. The salary was $60 a month, which was more than Margaret had earned in any complete year of her marriage, and the position included a private room in the main house and all meals. The letter had been forwarded twice before reaching her, which meant Walter Harding had been casting a wide net. She set the letter down. She looked around the kitchen of the house that was not technically hers anymore, given what Thomas had done with the deed before he died, though the attorney had advised her that under Kansas law, the outstanding balance of the first mortgage made any transfer. Thomas had attempted legally dubious at best, and the bank was in no hurry to resolve it because they were charging interest on the ambiguity. The kitchen had her mother's curtains in it, and the cast-iron stove she had purchased with her own wages at 23, and the long pine table that had come with the house when she and Thomas had first moved in, when she had still believed that certain things could be solved by scrubbing them hard enough. She picked the letter back up. She wrote back that same evening. She said yes. Thomas Hale had been the kind of man women warned each other about and then fell for anyway, which was a species that had been in continuous production since roughly the beginning of human society and showed no signs of thinning. Margaret had been 26 when she met him working the ledgers for her uncle's dry goods store in Abilene, which was a respectable occupation for a woman with a head for numbers and a father who had taught her that the ability to read a balance sheet was as useful as the ability to read a map and considerably less available. Thomas had walked in on a Wednesday afternoon with dust on his coat and a grin that suggested he found the whole world faintly amusing, and that this amusement was a quality he was generously sharing with everyone in it. He was handsome in the reckless way of men who have never been told no with any conviction behind it. Dark-haired, loose-limbed, with an ease of movement that suggested everything came naturally to him, which was true in the sense that he had never had to work for any quality he possessed, but not true in the sense that the qualities themselves were actually valuable. He had a laugh that could make a room turn around. He could tell a story about a cattle drive he had been on 6 years ago and make it feel like it was happening right now in front of you, with the dust and the noise and the smell of it vivid in the air. He was charming in the way that she would later understand was a skill he had cultivated with the same deliberate practice other men applied to marksmanship or horse breaking. Not native warmth, though it resembled it closely, but a learned capability so thoroughly rehearsed that even he may have lost track of the original distinction. They were married inside of 4 months. She had been proud of herself for making him wait that long. Her uncle had taken her aside 2 weeks before the wedding and said, "Maggie, that man has a hole in him that nothing's going to fill, and you'll spend your life trying to fill it." She had thanked him for his concern, which he had correctly interpreted as a way of ending the conversation, and she had married Thomas Hale on a bright Saturday morning in June, and believed standing at the front of the church in her mother's altar dress with the whole of her life open before her that she was beginning something. She had been beginning something, just not what she thought. The debts came slowly at first, the way water comes through a cracked foundation. A small damp patch that you tell yourself is nothing that you tell yourself will dry on its own. Thomas was a gambler. Not the casual kind, not the man who loses a few dollars on a Saturday night and comes home sheepish and spends Sunday being useful around the house by way of penance. The kind who would disappear for 3 weeks at a stretch and come back with bloodshot eyes and a story that never quite held together, and a new debt to an increasingly dangerous category of creditor. The kind whose relationship to money was fundamentally different from most people's relationship to money, which was to say that he understood it primarily as something that passed through his hands on its way somewhere else, and the goal was to make it pass through as pleasurably as possible in the brief interval during which it was present. Margaret had paid off 4 of those debts herself quietly, with money she had been setting aside from the household accounts in the methodical way that was her nature, putting away $1 here and 2 there in the cash box she kept in the flour tin in the kitchen. She had never told Thomas. She had not wanted him to know she had it, because the knowledge of an available resource would have told him how much more he could spend, and she had understood, not at first, but by the end of the first year, that she was managing around him rather than with him, that she was treating her husband the way you treat a structural problem in a building, not by fixing it, but by redirecting load away from the compromised element so that the rest of the structure can function. She had covered for him. She had lied to his brother, a decent man named Amos, who had moved to Nebraska and sent letters that Thomas sometimes read and sometimes did not. She had lied to the banker, Mr. Pruitt, who had a face like a disappointed horse, and who had asked her twice in the first 3 years about Thomas's business activities with the careful neutrality of a man who already suspected the answer. She had lied to the sheriff, who had come to the door with questions on 2 separate occasions. Questions she had answered with a steady voice and steady hands and a heart she had trained herself to keep precisely still in her chest while the rest of her screamed. She had done all of it because she had believed for a very long time that love required it. Not just love in the sentimental sense, but love in the frontier sense. The practical endurance of hard conditions, because the alternative was worse, the stubborn daily maintenance of something valuable against the steady pressure of forces that wanted it to fail. She had loved Thomas in the way that she did most difficult things, with complete commitment and the tacit acceptance that the thing was going to cost her something real. What she had not calculated, because she was a woman of considerable intelligence, and this is the thing that considerable intelligence does not protect you from, was that the cost did not have a floor. Thomas died on a Thursday night outside a gambling house in Dodge City, shot by a man named Rourke, whose first name she never learned, and whose face she had seen once in a daguerreotype in the coroner's report. The debt he left behind was $1,200 spread across 3 creditors. One of them, a man she later determined was connected to operations that operated well outside the reach of any legitimate law enforcement and had been for years. There was also in the lining of his traveling bag, found at the boarding house where he had been staying for the previous week, cataloged by the sheriff's deputy with the careful disinterest of a man who had cataloged the belongings of many men who had died like this, a small leather notebook. The deputy had not known what to make of the notebook. The shorthand notations, the coded column of initials and figures, the dates that did not correspond to any itinerary or business she could identify. He had handed it to her with the traveling bag and the $3.40 that had been in Thomas's coat pocket, in the slightly worn pair of gloves that she had given him for Christmas, 1885, and she had put everything in the cedar chest without fully examining it, because she was at that particular moment existing in the compressed gray space that occurs in the first days after significant loss, in which the nervous system refuses to process more than the minimum required to keep the body operational. She had read the notebook 6 weeks later, sitting at her kitchen table, working through it slowly, the way she worked through anything that required close attention. She had not understood it entirely. She had understood enough. She had locked the notebook back in the cedar chest, and she had not opened it again until she was in Colorado. The road to Silver Creek Ranch left the main stage road at a split cottonwood that someone had painted with a white X, A Western convention she had not encountered before, but understood immediately as she understood most conventions that had a practical logic to them. And then followed a creek bed north for 4 miles through scrub oak and sage that had the particular silver-gray exhaustion of high country growth in late October, already shutting itself down for winter. The creek was low but running a thin voice over smooth stone, and the cottonwoods along its bank had gone their full autumn gold, the leaves releasing in the dry air and tumbling south with the light wind. Margaret drove carefully. The wagon was not her best one. Her best wagon had gone to a creditor in July, along with the good harness and the milk cow and the better of the 2 saddle horses, which had been the period of her life she thought of as the dismantling, in which everything that could be converted to currency in service of the debts was converted, and the stripped remainder was evaluated without sentiment to determine what was actually necessary. What was left after that process was an education. She had needed an education more than she had needed the milk cow. She crested a low rise at mid-afternoon and saw the ranch spread below her in the valley, and she stopped the wagon without consciously deciding to, because what she saw required a moment of simply looking. It was larger than she had expected. The main house was 2 stories built of dressed stone with a covered porch running the full width of the front, and the stone had the particular weathered quality of a building that has been standing through serious winters for a long time and intends to continue. Behind it stood a barn of weathered red board large enough for serious hay storage, and 2 stock pens with good rail construction, and a hay storage shed, and a bunkhouse set a sensible distance from the main house, and what appeared to be a small separate structure near the creek that she could not identify from this distance. The pastures ran south and east, fenced with split rails in various states of maintenance, some sections clearly recent, others worn and leaning, which told her something about where the operational priorities had been and where they had not. She could see cattle in the distance moving through the dry grass in the afternoon light, the slow drift of a herd that knows where it is and where the water is, and has no particular urgency about the intervening distance. There were good horses in the near pen, 3 of them visible a bay, and 2 roans with the compact, well-muscled build of working stock rather than show animals. Beyond everything filling the entire western and northern horizon, the Rocky Mountains rose in a wall of blue and white that she had been seeing for 2 days of travel and still had not grown accustomed to. She had spent her life in the flat country of Kansas and the rolling country of central Missouri before that, and the mountains retained the quality of something her eyes could not entirely reconcile with the scale of other things she knew. They were simply too large, too permanent, too indifferent to the smallness happening in front of them. It was, she thought, a working place. Not pretty in the way of houses built for visiting and entertaining, but solid and purposeful in the way that a good tool is purposeful. Everything the right size and in the right place for the actual work it was meant to do. She found she trusted it more for that. She was halfway down the rise when she heard hoofbeats, and then a man on a gray horse came up the track toward her at a comfortable trot. The kind of trot that covers ground without hurry. The gait of a man who has learned that economy of effort and economy of time are the same thing in ranch country. He pulled up 20 yards out and looked at her with the frank, unhurried appraisal that was standard currency in frontier territory, and Margaret looked back with the same currency and performed her own quiet inventory. He was perhaps 45, lean through the shoulders in the way of men who work hard with their actual bodies rather than lifting weights for recreation, with light brown hair going gray at the temples, and a jaw that was angular and sun-darkened, and carried a long-heeled scar along its lower line that she noticed because she had always noticed things that told her how a person had encountered difficulty. He wore a hat that had seen serious weather, not in the broken-down way of neglect, but in the softened-shaped way of a hat that has been worn hard for years and conformed to the particular architecture of the head it covered. His face was the kind that does not move much, but says more in small movements for the stillness around them. He had what her uncle used to call steady eyes, the kind that looked at you directly and then did not look away, not because they were challenging you, but because they simply had no particular reason to look elsewhere. He wore a Colt on his right hip holster, worn from use rather than decoration, the leather soft and dark with the oil of regular cleaning. "Mrs. Hale," he said. "That's right. Caleb Harding." He did not offer his hand across the distance between them, which was sensible rather than rude, but he touched his hat brim with the particular correctness of a man who knows the forms without finding them interesting. "My father is expecting you." He would have come out himself, but his physician has him confined to the house most afternoons. I can take your wagon around to the barn if you would like to walk up to the house. I can drive my own wagon, she said. Something moved across his face. Not quite a frown, not quite nothing either. It was the slight recalibration of a man encountering a response he had not predicted, which she found slightly interesting because the response she had given was not to her mind particularly surprising. "I'll ride ahead then," he said, and turned the horse without waiting for a reply. Margaret watched him go for a moment. He sat his horse well weight-centered, and easy, the kind of rider who has put in enough miles that the movement is entirely natural. He had not offered to help her with the team, which could mean he was rude, or that he was practical, or that he had looked at her team and her handling of it and concluded she did not require assistance. She suspected the third option. She clicked her tongue to the team and followed him down the track towards Silver Creek Ranch, and whatever she was beginning here, which she did not yet know, but which felt as she drove into the afternoon shadow of the valley, like something she had earned the right to. Walter Harding was smaller than she had imagined from the letter. The letter had described a man who had built a cattle operation from 300 acres and a borrowed bull into 1,400 acres of productive rangeland, which was the kind of sentence that produced involuntarily an image of a large man who took up a considerable amount of room. The man who met her on the porch was slight and white-haired, wrapped in a heavy wool coat despite the mild afternoon temperature, in the way of someone whose circulation had become unreliable, with the papery skin and careful movements of a man who has recently been reminded in the most visceral terms that his body has opinions about what it will and will not do anymore. But his eyes were sharp and dark and warm, and when he took her hand, he held it firmly, rather than delicately the way men sometimes held women's hands as a courtesy that came out as condescension. A light, careful grip that communicated you are fragile before you have given them any reason to believe it. Walter Harding gripped her hand the way you grip the hand of someone you intend to work with. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "you are earlier than I expected." "I left Gunnison before dawn," she said. "I like to make use of the full day." Something in his expression shifted slightly in a direction she recognized as approval, and she recognized it as genuine rather than performed because it was in his eyes, and not just in the arrangement of his mouth. "Come inside. Rosario has coffee on, and I want to show you the books before the light goes." The ranch house interior was clean but thoroughly lived in, the furniture solid and largely undecorated, the walls hung with a few framed photographs. A daguerreotype of a woman she took to be Walter's late wife, a group portrait of men she could not identify, a survey map of the valley that had been annotated in pencil until it was half covered in notations and cross-references and small diagrams that told her the map was a working document rather than a decoration. The kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke and the particular dusty warmth of a house that has been lived in hard for a long time, a smell that was not unpleasant but was very specific and told her things about the domestic arrangement here with the efficiency of well-read evidence. A Mexican woman about Margaret's own age was at the stove, moving through the tasks of food preparation with the authoritative efficiency of someone who has been running this kitchen for years and has strong feelings about how it is run. Walter introduced her as Rosario, who managed the house and had done so for 11 years, and Rosario looked at Margaret with the direct and measuring gaze of a woman who has a territory and is deciding what category of entity has just entered it. Margaret looked back with the equivalent directness and what she hoped was the clear signal that she had no interest in anyone's territory except the financial records. Rosario gave a short assenting nod that seemed to conclude some internal assessment and returned to the stove. "The books are in the office," Walter said, leading her down a short hallway. "I should warn you, Caleb has many skills. Accounting is not among them." The office held a desk, 2 chairs, a window facing east, and a state of financial documentation that made Margaret stop in the doorway and simply look for a moment. 4 years of ledgers stacked in a pile that was not quite straight, interspersed with loose receipts that had been tucked into the ledgers without any evident organizational principle, mixed with contracts and tax assessments, and a cattle registration document that had somehow ended up filed between 2 invoices for fencing wire in what appeared to be 1886. The ledger on top was open to a page that had been started in one handwriting and continued in a different, smaller handwriting, which meant 2 different people had been working the same book without a clear system between them. There were columns that had been totaled incorrectly. There were figures from one account that should have been credited to another. There was on one particularly arresting page a line that read simply, "Myc expenses, June," followed by a figure large enough to suggest it was covering a significant number of things that were not being individually itemized. "Yes," Walter said, reading her silence accurately. "That is why you are here." She set down her coat and her gloves. She pulled out the chair. She sat and she began to read. Walter left her to it without comment, which was the correct thing to do, and which told her something useful about him. He was a man who knew when to get out of the way, which was rarer and more valuable than most people credited. She was still reading an hour later, working her way systematically back through the second ledger, when she heard boots in the hallway and looked up to find Caleb Harding in the doorway with a cup of coffee. He set it on the edge of the desk with a brief, businesslike nod. It was good coffee, she noticed, hot and real, not the scorched or thin version that got made in households where coffee was an afterthought. "Rosario thought you might want this," he said. "Thank you." She looked at him directly in the way she looked at things she was trying to read. "Your father said the accounts were in poor condition. That is a generous description." His jaw tightened in a small, controlled way. "I run cattle, Mrs. Hale, not columns of numbers." "Yes," she said, "I can see that." She held his gaze and kept her voice completely level, which was important. "I can fix this, but I'll need the full cooperation of whoever handles purchasing and the payroll authorizations." "That would be me." "Then we'll need to sit down together. Probably for the better part of a full day once I've had the time to sort through the complete picture here." He stood in the doorway for a moment with the particular stillness of a man who has made up his mind about something and is encountering evidence that requires him to reconsider it without having been given sufficient time to complete the reconsideration. His eyes were very steady. She returned the steadiness without difficulty. "I'll make the time," he said, and left without additional commentary, which she found she respected more than if he had been gracious about it. She picked up the coffee. She turned back to the ledger. She learned the lay of the land in pieces over the first several days, the way you learn any unfamiliar country. One landmark at a time, checking each new feature against the others, building a map in your head that would eventually be reliable, but was presently still incomplete and required constant correction. Silver Creek Ranch ran 1,400 acres, most of it rangeland, with the creek forming the eastern boundary before it dropped south toward the Gunnison River. They ran 400 head of cattle down from 600 3 years ago due to a combination of summer drought, an outbreak of blackleg fever in 1886, and a land dispute with the operation to the north that Walter had mentioned once, and then declined to discuss further with a carefully neutral expression that told her the topic had dimensions she had not yet been shown. There were 8 hands total, including a foreman named Pete, who was 50 years old and missing 2 fingers on his left hand from an incident with a branding iron. He described with a brevity that suggested the story was told differently to different audiences, and who regarded Margaret with the open skepticism of a man who has been the operational authority on this piece of land for 7 years and is now being asked to accommodate a category of supervision he has not previously encountered. Pete's skepticism was professional rather than hostile, which she could work with. She spent her first 3 mornings walking the fence lines and the water system with him, asking questions that were specific enough to demonstrate she knew what she was asking about, listening to his answers with the full attention she gave to all information that came from someone who knew the physical reality of a thing from direct experience. By the 3rd morning, his posture had shifted perceptibly from the closed-off stillness of a man waiting to be condescended to towards something more like the alert bearing of a man conducting a real conversation. She did not note this aloud. She kept asking questions. Walter's younger son, Eli Harding, arrived on the 3rd day. He rode in from the direction of town on a well-groomed bay horse, and even from the kitchen window, Margaret could see that he was the sort of man who had been told too often and too early that he was charming. He was 42 and handsome, with the particular deliberateness of a man who pays attention to the mirror and has been rewarded for doing so with light eyes and the easy movement of someone who has never had cause to be self-conscious about his body in a room. When he dismounted and caught sight of Margaret coming out to the porch, he smiled with the warm, encompassing smile of a man who treats women as a category rather than as individuals. Not maliciously, but out of the comfortable habit of someone for whom women have generally responded warmly to a particular presentation and who has therefore never had much incentive to develop a more specific approach. "Well," he said, removing his hat with a slight flourish, "Father said he had hired a ranch manager. He did not adequately describe the situation." The situation, Margaret said, is that your father's books are 4 years behind reconciliation, and the ranch is losing money through 3 operational inefficiencies I've found so far. I suspect there is a fourth. Eli's smile remained in place through this, with the undisturbed quality of a man who has made a habit of not letting information inconvenience his presentation. Mrs. Hale, he said, I think we are going to get along very well. I'm not here to get along very well, she said. I'm here to make your father's operation solvent. She went back inside. She heard him laugh behind her on the porch, which she found more interesting than a fence would have been. A man who could laugh at the wall you had just built in front of him rather than sulking about it was either genuinely good-natured or calculating, and she intended to find out which. That evening at supper, with all four of them at the long table for the first time, Walter at the head, Margaret to his right, at his insistence, Caleb and Eli across from each other, she saw for the first time the particular geometry of this family in a setting designed to reveal it. Walter sat at the table with the quiet authority of a man who built the room he was sitting in, and every room before it, and the slight tightness around his eyes suggested that looking at his sons over the supper table was one of the pleasures he was trying not to ration too obviously. Eli moved through the meal with the social ease of a man who is comfortable performing and who genuinely enjoys the performance and the warmth he turned on everyone. On Margaret, on his father, even on Rosario, who received it with the benign tolerance of a woman who has known him since he was 12, was real in the way that things can be real, even when they are also deliberate. Caleb ate with the focused efficiency of a man who views meals as fuel rather than event. He said perhaps 8 things during the entire meal, and each of them was specific and useful. A report on the East pasture fence, a question about feed pricing in Gunnison, a brief comment about a hand who had been showing signs of something that sounded respiratory. When he was not speaking, he was watching things with the quiet, comprehensive attention of a man whose business is reading weather and terrain and cattle condition, and who has applied that same observational habit to every other aspect of the world around him. He watched her, she noticed. Not the way Eli watched, which was the way you watch something you are considering. Caleb watched the way a man watches something he is trying to understand, as though she were a feature of the landscape. He was building a map of something with dimensions and significance that were not yet entirely legible. She helped Rosario clear the table without being asked, which produced a brief silence from all 3 men, as though this was not a development they had predicted. She went to the office and worked the ledgers until the candle burned to a stub. When she finally made her way upstairs to her room, she stood at the window and looked out at the dark shapes of the mountains against the deeper dark of the sky. Somewhere out there, she was fairly certain someone was still looking for something Thomas had left behind. She had not told Walter Harding about the notebook. She had not told anyone. She was a woman who had learned in 11 years of managing around a man who left wreckage that information was the only currency she had ever consistently controlled, and she was not going to spend what she had until she understood the value of the market she was in. She got into the narrow bed. The window was cold. The wind came down off the mountains with a sound like something very large breathing at a great distance. Eventually, she slept. The first real argument happened over fence line, which was, Margaret thought, probably the right thing for a first real argument to be about on a cattle ranch. She had spent a week with the ledgers before she found it, a pattern in the grazing rotation records that did not match the physical layout of the pastures she had walked herself on the second day. Someone had been moving the east herd through the southern pastures in a sequence that made no agronomic sense from a pasture recovery standpoint, cycling back to sections that had not had sufficient rest time before putting cattle back on them, while the northern section, which had better grass and better water access from what she had seen on her fence line walks, was being underused to a degree that suggested either ignorance of the pasture condition or a reason for avoiding it that had nothing to do with the grass. She mapped the rotation pattern on the survey chart on the office wall with a red pencil marking the cycle intervals and the recovery time between grazing periods for each section. The result was immediately legible. The south pastures were being worked past their recovery capacity, while the north section sat largely idle. She also ran the current grass height estimates Pete had given her against the approximate daily consumption of 400 head, and calculated that at the present rotation schedule, Silver Creek would enter winter with approximately 20% less forage buffer than was prudent at this elevation. She brought the chart to Caleb on a Saturday morning when he came in from the first rounds of chores, which meant 7:30 in the morning, and she had been awake since 5. He came into the kitchen with the cold morning air still on his coat and sawdust in his hair from something in the barn, and she set the chart on the kitchen table in front of him. I want to change the rotation, she said. Move the east herd to the north section and give the south pasture through the rest of October to recover before the ground freezes. He looked at the chart. He looked up at her. He had the alert, slightly narrowed look of a man who has been up since before dawn and is deciding whether the thing in front of him requires his full attention or the part of his attention that can run while something else is also happening. The north section has 3 broken fence posts at the creek crossing. We haven't had time to repair them. I know, she said. I walked it on Wednesday. Those 3 posts could be repaired in half a day with 2 men. We're a week out from fall roundup. I can't spare 2 men for fence work right now. I need everyone on the herd. If you keep the south herd on that south pasture for another week, you're going to have a grass shortfall going into winter, she said. I've run the carrying capacity against the current growth rate. The recovery rate on overworked pasture at this elevation is... I know what overworked pasture looks like, he said. The tone was flat rather than sharp, but it had edge in it. I've been running this ranch for 12 years, Mrs. Hale. Then you know I'm right, she said. This landed in the kitchen in the particular silence of a statement that has hit a target, and she held her ground in it and looked at him steadily and waited to see what he would do with it. He looked at the chart again. He looked at his coffee. He looked back at the chart with the expression of a man who has arrived at 2 conclusions simultaneously and is not pleased with either of them, which she had found was often the expression that preceded reasonable action when the man doing the concluding had a reasonable core underneath the defensive exterior. I'll send 2 men to the north fence on Monday, he said. You can shift the rotation on Tuesday. She had been prepared to argue further, had assembled the next 3 points and the evidence for them, and the concession, offered without fanfare, without any performance of graciousness, simply stated and left there, stopped her in the middle of loading the next round. She recalibrated. She had encountered 2 kinds of pride in her experience, the kind that needed to win and the kind that needed to be right. They looked similar from the outside, but behaved very differently when you brought evidence to the table. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. The feed math is your department. He picked up his coffee. Try to give me a day's notice before you redesign the next piece of the operation. I'll try, she said. She took the chart back to the office, and she was careful about her expression as she went. The days took on their rhythm, which was the rhythm of a working ranch in autumn. Early and cold and full of tasks that had the urgency of things that must be done before the weather closes down, which in Colorado meant you were always working against a deadline you could not accurately predict. Margaret was up before dawn to check the water levels in the creek-fed troughs, a task she had inherited from an aging hand named Sutter, who had strained his back in the 2nd week of October and could no longer manage the morning walk across the yard and down the south slope to the trough line. She had not been asked to take it on. She had simply observed that Sutter was not doing it and that it needed to be done and that she was awake anyway, and the information she gathered from the morning trough levels was directly useful for the water allocation calculation she was building into the revised ledger system. It was from her perspective purely practical. Caleb noticed within 3 days. He said nothing about it. He began leaving a lantern lit on the porch hook before he went out for his own early rounds so that she would have light to navigate the yard in the dark. He did not mention this either. She noticed that he had done it, and she noted that he had not mentioned it, and she understood that the gesture and the silence around it were together a kind of communication she had not encountered in a long time. The riding was her particular pleasure in those weeks. Walter had told her she was welcome to use any of the working horses, and she had chosen a sorrel mare named Juniper on the 2nd day. Chosen her because the horse had a comfortable trot and the settled, even temperament of an animal that has been handled consistently and well, which she associated with the same quality in people. She rode out 3 mornings a week to check herd conditions in the east pastures and came back with notes she incorporated into her weekly operational reports, which Walter read from his bed on the mornings when he was not well enough to come downstairs. In the 2nd week, Caleb fell in beside her at the gate on a Tuesday morning without prelude or explanation and said, "I'll show you the creek boundary. You'll need to know it when the water levels change in spring." They rode east for 2 hours along the fence lines and through the creek bottom and along the ridge above the valley, and she learned the eastern boundary the way you learn things from someone who has loved a piece of land for a long time. Not as an abstract map, but as a sequence of lived-in specifics, each one carrying some annotation of history or use. There was a stand of cottonwoods where a family of coyotes had denned for at least 20 years, Caleb said since his father's time, and they gave the coyotes a wide berth by mutual agreement because the coyotes understood which cattle were available to them. There was a rock formation above the creek bend, a shelf of gray sandstone big enough to sit on, from which you could see the entire valley on a clear morning, the whole of what a man had built visible in one direction from that height. There was a stretch of fence that had been repaired so many times the original posts were almost entirely gone, replaced a few at a time over the years, and Caleb put his hand on one of the newer posts as they passed and said without particular inflection, "My wife planted the trees on the other side of this section. She liked the idea of an orchard." He said it the way a man says something he has said to himself many times in private and is testing the sound of aloud. She did not look at him when he said it. She looked at the trees, 3 young apples, she thought, and what might be a pear planted in a line along the far side of the fence with the careful spacing of someone who had been thinking about what they would look like in 20 years. She had good taste in land, Margaret said. He looked sideways at her. He seemed to be weighing something. She did, he said, and they rode on. She had already heard the outline of Clara from Rosario, who had told her on the 4th day with the directness of someone who believes in accurate intelligence. Caleb's wife had died of scarlet fever in 1876, 12 years ago, along with the child she had been carrying, and Caleb had come out the other side of it with the particular quality of a man who has been reduced to fundamentals and has decided consciously or not that fundamentals are enough to build on. He had run the ranch. He had been reliable and competent and present. He had not in the 12 years since been attached to anyone in any way that went beyond the professional. Rosario had delivered this last fact with the careful neutrality of a woman stating the weather, but there was something underneath the neutrality that Margaret, listening, had recognized as a form of hope, that had been waiting for something she had not been willing to name. 1. Eli made his interest clear within the first 2 weeks. He did it with the considerable elegance of a man who has spent 42 years developing a particular skill, which was to say that he was never quite explicit about it, but was consistently attentive in a way that created a warm pressure without ever quite crossing into the territory that could be politely objected to. He remembered things she had said in previous conversations. He brought her a book from Montrose that he said he thought she might enjoy, which was a volume of essays about agricultural management that was actually useful and which she suspected had required genuine attention to who she was rather than a generic assessment of what women liked. He was present at meals and absent at strategic moments, which created the sense of being sought without being crowded. She found she enjoyed his company more than she found him useful to the operation, which was its own kind of verdict. He had the frontier man's working knowledge of cattle, practical and competent, but his attention wandered from the operational details in ways that suggested his real interest was elsewhere, in the social and commercial life of Montrose, in the land brokering work he described, in terms that were always slightly more vague than they should have been from a man asking for her to accept them as accurate, in a quality of engagement with the present moment that was pleasing to be around, but that she had learned with Thomas to look past toward whatever was sustaining it. One evening she came through the barn on her way back from the South Pasture check and found Eli in conversation with Pete, both men leaning against the stall door with their voices low. They stopped when she entered, not quickly, not guiltily, but with the measured stopping of men who have been discussing something private and are pausing out of manners rather than alarm. She noted the quality of the silence. She noted that Eli met her eyes with his usual easy warmth, and Pete did not quite meet hers, which was different from Pete's usual manner, with her which had moved over the previous 2 weeks towards something approaching direct. "Long day?" Eli asked. "They're all long," she said. "That's what I'm paid for." She moved through to the tack room. She hung the bridle. She did not look back, but she listened to the quality of the silence behind her as she went, and then to the equally quiet resumption of conversation after she was out of sight, and she put the observation in the place where she kept things that had not yet told her what they meant. The first storm of the season came in the 2nd week of November with the speed and totality of mountain weather that operates on its own schedule and does not advertise its arrivals. Margaret was 3 miles out on the East Range, attending to a heifer that Pete had flagged as possibly carrying a displaced calf. The animal had been off her feed for 2 days and was moving with the slightly wide stance caution of a cow whose interior geography was presenting difficulties. Margaret had found the heifer assessed her, determined the presentation was borderline, but likely to resolve without intervention, and was halfway back to the ranch when the temperature dropped 15 degrees in 20 minutes, and the wind shifted hard to the northwest, and the sky turned the yellow-gray color that Sutter had told her in the careful instructional tone of a man who has made his peace with how things work here, was the color of serious trouble on this side of the mountains. She put Juniper into a canter. The mare needed no encouragement. Animals read weather faster than people do, and Juniper had grown up in Colorado. The snow came in earnest when she was still a mile out, and what had been a clear afternoon track became within 10 minutes a condition of limited visibility and ground-level wind that pushed the snow horizontal and turned the landscape into a gray-white wall of moving air that swallowed landmarks and made navigation by sight unreliable. She picked her direction by the feel of the wind. If she kept it at her left shoulder, she was moving southwest, which should bring her to the fence line, and from there she could follow the fence back to the main gate even blind. She found the fence. She was following it south, feeling the tension on Juniper's reins that meant the mare was working harder than preferred when a horse loomed out of the white ahead and resolved itself into Caleb on the gray moving, at a careful trot with his head ducked against the wind. Not panicked, the particular unhurried speed of a man covering ground purposefully. He pulled up hard when he saw her. Something moved across his face that was brief and unreadable in the swirling snow. "Storm came fast," he said. "I noticed," she said. "There's a line shack 200 yards east, old trapping cabin. We should wait it out there." He was already turning. "Come on." She followed him into the white. He moved without hesitation, which meant he was navigating by memory rather than sight, and she stayed on his left and slightly behind and trusted the quality of the certainty in his movement, which was the kind of trust that is not sentiment but observation. The cabin appeared out of the storm with the sudden solidity of something you nearly run into, a low, dark structure against the darker shape of a spruce stand behind it. It smelled inside of cold ash and old wood, and the small, persistent presence of mice in the wall spaces, and the single window had oilskin tacked over the frame where glass had once been, and the oilskin snapped and belled in the wind with a sound like someone trying to get in. There was a wood box with dry split pine and a functional stove, and a shelf of matches in a tin, and 2 wooden chairs and a plank bunk with a folded blanket that smelled of cedar and dust. It was basic in the thorough way of frontier utility construction, and Margaret found she was grateful for every function it served. Caleb built the fire with the efficient movements of a man who has done it without light in bad weather before, and she unsaddled both horses and led them into the lean-to, attached to the cabin's south wall, where there was a hitching ring and a hook for tack and a small manger. And by the time she came back inside, the stove was already throwing real heat and Caleb was standing near it with his hat off. His hair was dark with snowmelt. He looked older without the hat and somehow more himself. The hat being a kind of professional armor that working men in this country wore, as a matter of course, a brim between themselves and the sky, and everyone looking at them, and without it, his face had the slightly exposed quality of a thing seen in better light. He was watching the stove. He had the focused inward look of a man who is deciding what to do with a situation that is requiring him to be in a small room with a woman he has been carefully maintaining professional distance from. Margaret sat in one of the chairs and pulled off her gloves to warm her hands. The wind hit the cabin in long gusts that worked through the chinking between the logs with a cold, thin whisper that said the storm had more in it yet. "How long do you think?" she asked. "Could be 2 hours. Could be overnight." He turned his hat in his hands without looking at it. "I should have checked the sky before I let you go out alone." She looked at him with some sharpness. "I'm not your responsibility, Mr. Harding. You're on my ranch. Your father's ranch." Something settled in his jaw, not anger, resolution. "His name my watch. That's how it's worked for 12 years. She said nothing to that because the statement was self-evidently true, and because she was aware that arguing with it would be arguing with something that was less a policy than a fact of his character, which was a different kind of argument entirely. The fire crackled. Outside, the mountain weather worked itself into something that was more than wind, a full-throated roaring that had weight and pressure, and the quality of something that does not particularly care about the structures in its way. "You're very good at this," Caleb said. He was looking at the stove door, the orange glow of it moving across his face. "At being caught in blizzards. At the work, the books, the rotation analysis, the water management. Pete told me this morning you found a hairline crack in the south trough seam. He said he'd been watching the level drop for 2 years without being able to locate the source." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She had found the crack in the trough on the third morning of her early rounds and reported it to Pete as a maintenance item, plain and functional, without making anything of the fact that she had found it. She had not expected it to come back to her this way. The light hits the water surface at a specific angle just after sunrise, she said. You can see it in the light pattern when it's refracting through a crack. You have to be there at the right time. You're there every morning before 6. The information is useful for the water allocation calculations. That's not in your contract. No, she said, but it needed to be done. He turned and looked at her, then fully with the sustained attention he reserved for things that required understanding rather than simple assessment, and the firelight was doing things with the shadows on his face that made it harder than usual to read. She looked back with the directness she had always used as a shield and a signal both. The steadiness that said, I see you clearly and am not going to pretend otherwise. Claire used to say, he said and stopped. The fire worked in the silence. She used to say that the ranch would tell you what it needed if you listened to it right. She meant the land itself, the way it showed drought stress or health or the early signs of trouble if you paid it the right kind of attention. She had a quality of attention that was very particular. He looked away from her. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man who has said more than he intended and is not certain whether to continue. I haven't heard the ranch that clearly since she died, he said. 12 years, you seem to hear it. Margaret was quiet with the weight of that for a moment. Outside, the snow roared on. I pay attention to what's in front of me, she said. I always have. Your husband, he said quietly and carefully, as though testing the structural integrity of each word before putting weight on it. Did he know that about you? The question was direct in the way that his questions always were, without the pretense of indirection that most people employed when they were moving close to something that might have heat in it. She considered it honestly. He knew, she said. He chose to regard it as a liability rather than an asset, something to be managed around. Caleb was quiet. He held his hat in both hands, looking at the floor between his boots. He was wrong, he said. She did not respond to that. The statement did not require a response. It sat in the cabin's warmth with the clean factuality of something that is true without needing to be argued, and she found she was grateful for that quality, for the absence of the elaborate social negotiation that most people employed around the territory of difficult truths, the hedging and the qualification and the careful look to see how it landed before committing to having said it. They sat in the firelight through the storm. They did not talk much, but the quality of the silence was different from the silences they had inhabited together in the previous weeks. This silence had the particular density of two people who have said something that cannot be unsaid and who are in the process of adjusting to what the said thing has changed. On the ride home the next morning through the brilliant aftermath of the storm, the sky a cold, perfect blue, the snow 3 inches deep and unmarked the whole of the valley glittering in the early light, with the particular hard beauty of high country winter mornings that seemed to Margaret to be actively hostile to sentiment. Everything too clear and cold and real for anything soft to survive it. Caleb rode beside her at a walk, and they were almost back to the gate when he said without looking at her, My father likes you. I like him, she said. He needs someone to trust with the ranch. His heart isn't going to get better. A pause in which she could hear him deciding something. I want you to know that whatever happens with the broader situation, your position here isn't contingent on anything other than the work itself. She understood what he was doing. He was drawing a line around the professional arrangement with precision and care, as a man with his particular history would being careful and deliberate because he was afraid of what he might do if he were not. She recognized it because it was the behavior of someone who was being scrupulous precisely at the point where scrupulousness was hardest. I appreciate that, she said. He nodded once. They rode through the gate. Eli was waiting, leaning against the post with his arms crossed, and the casual arrangement of someone who has been there for a while and does not intend to reveal how long. He looked at the two of them, riding in together from the direction of the hill country, with a careful expression that had something working behind it that he was managing with his usual smoothness, but not quite managing completely. Thought I might need to send a search party, he said. Sheltered in the line shack, Caleb said. Storm came down fast. Yes, Eli said. It did. His eyes moved between his brother and Margaret with the quality of reading something, and he came to whatever conclusion he came to and let it go, or appeared to. Well, breakfast. Margaret led Juniper to the barn, and behind her, she heard the brothers exchange a few words she did not try to catch, and she did not need to catch them, because she knew with the precise and uncomfortable accuracy of a woman who has always paid attention to what is actually happening rather than what is presented to be happening that the conversation between Caleb and Eli about the situation had been going on long before last night's storm and would be going on for some time afterward. Ape. Walter's health declined through November with the slow incremental quality of something you would not necessarily mark on any given day, but which was unmistakable when you look back across a week. Some mornings he was at the breakfast table, sharp and engaged, full of opinions about the beef market in Denver and the proposed railroad extension and the wisdom or foolishness of the current governor, and those mornings the house had the particular quality of itself at full operation. Other mornings he stayed in his room until noon, and on those days the ranch functioned with the same efficiency. Caleb and Pete and the hands moved through the work without pause. But the house had a held breath quality that Margaret recognized as the particular suspension of a household that knows a central weight is shifting. She sat with him on those slow mornings when he wanted company, bringing the ledger books to his room and reading him the financial summaries in the form of a brief report rather than a reading of columns, because Walter understood money intuitively in the way that men who have built something from nothing tend to. Not as abstract numbers, but as a story about resources and decisions, and what he wanted from her was the story, rather than the figures which she gave him, with the clean, direct delivery she had been developing her whole working life. "The land dispute," she said one morning, when the room was quiet and Walter was propped against his pillows, with his hands folded in the particular arrangement of a man who has given his body permission to rest, without quite giving his mind the same permission. "The one with the property to the north. Can you tell me about it?" He touched the sore tooth. "A man named Hatcher," he said, "bought land on the ridge above our north section about 7 years ago. He's been pushing a claim that the original 1879 survey of our north section contained an error. Says 600 acres we've been running cattle on for nearly a decade are actually his by right of survey correction." He paused. 3 years of legal pressure. And some other things. What other things? Cattle moved through the fence in ways that were not accidental. A fire 2 years ago in the North Hay Barn that the Montrose Marshal called accidental. 2 of my best hands quit last spring, which they were entirely entitled to do, but the timing and the conversations Pete had with them before they went suggested that they had received what you might call additional incentive. "Walter," she said, "I found something in the books I need to understand. There's a recurring expense that's been entered under miscellaneous operations for the last 18 months. Variable, but averaging around $60 a month. I need to know what it represents." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light through his window was the pale, level light of late autumn, and it made everything in the room look careful and serious. "That money," he said slowly, "is being paid to a man named Cord Fraley who works for Hatcher. He has been providing me with information about Hatcher's intentions and movements. He came to me 14 months ago and said he had seen things in the course of his employment that he was not comfortable with and that I should know about." He paused. "I did not enter it accurately in the books because I did not want that information in a document that could be requested by a court. You've been running an informant. I have been paying a man who may or may not have a conscience. The distinction is partly philosophical. What has he told you?" "That Hatcher intends to file in federal court on the survey claim that he has retained legal counsel from Denver and that he has methods available to him beyond the legal route if the legal route becomes inconvenient." Walter looked at her steadily, and there was something in his gaze that was a question rather than a statement. "I am telling you this because you have been in those books for 3 weeks and you were going to find it, and you deserve to know what you found." She sat with this for a while. The fire in his grate worked through a dry piece of pine with a quiet, persistent efficiency that she found calming. "Your sons," she said. "Do they know?" "Caleb knows the outline. He agrees with my approach or agrees with it enough to have let it proceed." Walter paused. "Eli, I am less certain of in questions that involve Hatcher." She did not ask him to expand on that. She made a note in the margin of the ledger she was holding, stood and said she would find a cleaner accounting entry for the Fraley payments, and would need to see whatever documentation existed on the original survey. She went back to the office. She sat at the desk. She looked at the survey map on the wall with its accumulated notations, and she turned slowly and carefully the 2 names she had read in Thomas's notebook that she now believed were connected to this valley. turning them the way you turn a key in a lock. You cannot yet see feeling for the moment when the tumblers align. She opened the ledger. She picked up her pen. She worked until the light outside the window went from pale winter gold to gray to the deep settled dark of a Colorado November night, and the mountains were invisible in it, and the creek was just a sound below the hill, and Silver Creek Ranch was quiet around her. The man from Kansas arrived on a Monday morning, which was the day Margaret found the second anomaly in the survey records, and understood with a precision that felt like cold water that the two discoveries were connected. She had been in the office since before daylight with the original land grant documents spread across the desk, dry, crackling paper that smelled of government offices and old importance, the kind of documents that have been significant and then stored and then retrieved in moments of crisis. The 1879 survey data was in poor shape, some of the original measurements partially illegible, and the survey notes themselves written in a technical shorthand she had been slowly working through with the help of a county surveying manual she had borrowed from Walter's bookshelf. What she had found that morning, working through the boundary markers, was that the benchmark notations for the north section's eastern boundary were referenced to a creek feature that, based on the current survey map, appeared to have moved, as creek features do over time, from the position noted in the original survey. Whether this constituted an actual error or simply a natural landscape change that did not affect the legal boundaries was a question she was not qualified to answer with certainty. But it was a question she could not stop asking. She heard hoofbeats in the yard, then Rosario's voice from the kitchen door speaking in the polite but firmly positioned tone she used with visitors who had not been expected, cordial enough to be civil, clear enough to be discouraging. Margaret moved to the window. The man was perhaps 50 broad through the chest, wearing a town suit that was too thin for Colorado in November, and the expression of someone who has been told to wait and has decided as a matter of principle that waiting is something other people do. He was looking at the house with the patient, thorough gaze of someone performing an inventory. He had not given his name to Rosario. That told Margaret several things, and none of them were the kind of thing you wanted to know about a stranger standing in your yard. She went through the kitchen. "It's all right, Rosario," she said, and stepped onto the porch. The man in the suit looked at her with the slight recalibration of someone who had expected someone else to come through the door and is adjusting his opening. His eyes were the color of creek water in winter gray and clear, and without particular warmth. "Mrs. Hale," he said. "You have the advantage of me," she said. "You know my name. My name is Gantry." He smiled in the way of a man who uses smiling as a professional tool. "I represent certain business interests. I have been looking for you since the spring, as it happens." "I have been here since October," she said. "You've had nearly a month." Montrose County is a large area. He looked around the yard with the methodical attention of someone who is noting exit routes and structural features for future reference. "I have some business with the estate of your late husband, Mrs. Hale." "My husband's estate was settled with his creditors before I left Abilene," she said. "I have documentation of every resolved claim." "I'm not here about debts," he said pleasantly. "The people I represent are interested in a different kind of property. Something they believe Thomas came into possession of, perhaps without fully understanding its value or its provenance. Something small, a document of some kind. They would very much appreciate its return." Margaret kept her face completely still, which was not difficult because she had been keeping her face still in situations like this for 11 years. "I don't know what you're referring to." "You might, though," he said. "Thomas was a resourceful man, the kind who kept things. And you were a resourceful woman yourself, a woman who noticed things as I understand it. He might have mentioned it, or left it somewhere for safekeeping." His eyes came back to her face and stayed there, and she held his gaze with the steady, unrevealing regard she would have given a difficult horse. "I'll be in Montrose for a while. Crawford Hotel. If your memory improves, I'd be grateful to hear from you." He touched the brim of his hat. He walked to his horse, mounted with the ease of a man who rides regularly, and rode out of the yard at a deliberate walk, unhurried, as though he had left something behind that he knew he could retrieve later. Margaret stood on the porch and watched him reach the main road and disappear south. Her hands were still. Her breathing was steady. Inside her chest was the particular tight, cold feeling she had come to associate with the boundary where controlled fear became operational awareness, and she had learned over the years that this feeling, correctly managed, was more useful than panic and more honest than pretending there was nothing to be afraid of. She went inside. She locked the office door, which she had not done before. She sat at the desk. She opened the bottom drawer where she had placed the cedar chest key on her first day. She looked at it for a moment without touching it. The notebook was in her room in the cedar chest wrapped in a flour sack exactly where it had been since she arrived. She had read it again carefully in the second week. Sitting at this desk with the ranch asleep around her, working through Thomas's notation system, with the patient systematic approach she brought to anything that required close decoding. Thomas had not been a careful man in most respects, but in the notebook he had been careful in a particular way that she had come to understand was the carefulness of a man who was afraid of the thing he was writing down. The abbreviations were consistent, the number formatting was consistent, and the entries had the quality, the specificity of amounts, the precision of dates, of someone who was building a record with a purpose in mind. What she was fairly certain the notebook contained was a record of corrupt transactions related to land claims or land transfers or both, involving money that had moved through this territory in ways that were not legal and that implicated people who were likely still alive and still in positions of authority. Two of the names she had partially decoded were names she had heard since arriving at Silver Creek in connection with the land dispute and the county governance of this valley. She understood now, sitting in the locked office with the November light falling cold and level through the east window, that the timing of Gantry's appearance was not coincidental with her employment here. Someone had tracked her here. Whether that tracking had been through the forwarding of the employment letter, through postal records or a contact in Abilene, or through some other means, the result was the same. They knew where she was. She needed to tell Caleb. She told him that evening after supper, asking him to come to the office with the directness of a woman who has made a decision and is not interested in performing uncertainty about it. When they were both seated, she told him everything in order Gantry's visit. The notebook's existence, what she believed it contained, the two names, the connection to the valley and the land dispute. She delivered it plainly and without the kind of emotional scaffolding that invites the listener to respond to the scaffolding rather than the substance, because the substance was what mattered, and there was enough of it. Caleb listened to all of it without interrupting. He had the quality in these moments of a man who has learned that listening completely is both more respectful and more useful than managing the conversation while it is happening. When she finished, he sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor for a while. "You've had this since Abilene," he said. "Yes." 3 years. "Yes." "You didn't tell my father." Not an accusation, a fact being verified. "I didn't know whether it was relevant here. I do now." She paused. "Or I strongly suspect it." He looked up. The lamp threw the shadows of the desk and the shelves across the walls, and his face was partly in it, and she could see him working through the implications with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to any problem that had multiple moving parts. "Can I see the notebook?" She had expected the question and had already decided on the answer. She went upstairs and retrieved it from the cedar chest still wrapped in the flour sack and brought it back and set it on the desk. He opened it. He read for 10 minutes, turning the pages carefully without rushing. She watched him from across the desk, watching his eyes move and his expression shift in small ways as something became legible to him. "I recognize some of these," he said. "Which ones?" He pointed to a pair of initials above a figure. JMH. That would be James Monroe Hatcher. The figure next to it, if that's acreage, it's almost exactly the 600 acres he's been claiming. Margaret nodded. She had worked this out herself, but wanted his confirmation. "And this?" He moved his finger to another entry. CDF. 3 entries. Cord Fraley. He looked up. "Fraley is in here with payments before he showed up at Hatcher's operation. If I'm reading this right, he was already on someone's payroll, Thomas's employer, whoever that was, before he went to work for Hatcher. Meaning he may have been placed there. Meaning your father's informant may have been a double agent from the beginning." Caleb closed the notebook and held it for a moment. Then he set it on the desk between them carefully, as though it had weight beyond its physical dimensions. Margaret. The first time he had used her given name had been in the line shack. This was the second time, and it had the same quality. Not a decision, but a fact slipping out. "Whoever used your husband to hold this documentation..." He stopped, tried again. "Thomas may not have understood what he was holding. Or he may have understood very well and been working an angle with it. I can't tell from these pages. But when he died, the people behind the scheme lost the documentation they needed to control the land fraud. They've been looking for it for 3 years. And Gantry is their recovery operation," she said. "Yes." He looked at her steadily. Do you understand what that means for your position here? For the ranch's position. It means I'm a liability, she said. Until this is resolved. It means you're in danger. The distinction was firm in his voice. Those are different things, and I want to be clear about which one I'm describing. Gantry didn't come here to have a polite conversation. He came here to assess what you have and how difficult it will be to retrieve it. She held his gaze. She had known this. She had been managing the knowledge of it for 3 weeks since the night she had walked the survey map and heard Gantry's name mentioned in the same sentence as county records. You should have told me sooner, he said. I know. She meant it, which was an unusual feeling for her because she had been right about the timing of her silences for most of her adult life and had built a considerable confidence in her own judgment about when to speak. I am telling you now. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, and the nod was not forgiveness. There was nothing to forgive, but something closer to the acceptance of the ground as it stood, which was what she had needed from him and was not sure she had the right to expect. Don't go anywhere alone until I've spoken with Pete about increasing his watch on the perimeters, and don't tell Eli about the notebook. She noted the second instruction and did not comment on it. All right. He stood. He picked up his hat. He was almost to the door when he stopped and stood there for a moment with his back to her and said, You've been carrying this for 3 years. Yes? That's a long time for one person to carry something. I didn't have anyone to carry it with, she said. Until now. He did not turn. She heard the small sound of air being taken in the almost imperceptible shift of a man encountering something he was not prepared for and was deciding whether to acknowledge it. Then he opened the door and went out, and his boots on the hallway floor were very quiet. She sat for a long time at the desk after he left with the open notebook in front of her, and the lamp burning low, and the particular feeling, fragile and unwelcome and entirely real, of not being alone with the weight of it anymore. The hay barn fire happened 3 nights later. Margaret woke to Rosario's voice in the hallway, low and urgent, and she was dressed and through the door and down the stairs and into the yard before she was entirely awake, the night air hitting her like cold water and snapping everything into immediate clarity. The north hay barn was burning, not fully yet, but with the rapid, committed quality of a fire that has found dry material in cold air and intends to make use of its opportunity. The east wall was the source, the boards running orange behind the cracks in the planking, and the fire was already moving up toward the roof overhang. She ran for the pump house. Pete was already there with 2 hands working the hand pump and bucket relay line operating with the compact efficiency of men who have drilled this procedure. It was not going to be enough for the east wall if the wind, which was currently still, decided to change its mind. The roof, she said to Pete. If we lose the overhang, we lose the whole structure. I know. He was running the same calculation. Second pump in the machine shed, she said. I'll get it. She was already moving. She heard Caleb behind her, somewhere in the yard, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of a man managing a crisis. Specific directive, no syllable wasted. She got the machine shed door open and moved the harrow that was blocking the second pump and the hand plow that was behind the harrow, and she pulled the pump out into the yard, and Caleb materialized beside her without announcement and lifted the other end without asking, and they ran it together to the main trough. The relay lines worked both walls. The fire was contained before the roof caught, though the east wall was a total loss, and perhaps a third of the winter hay stored along it had burned the bales going fast with a thick choking smoke that smelled of late summer, still preserved in the dried grass. When it was over, Margaret's eyes were burning from the smoke and her arms ached from the pump work, and her coat was soaked through from the spray. She stood at the base of the east wall with a lantern and looked at the char pattern for a long time. The fire had started at the base of the east wall, roughly centered. The char moved outward and upward from that point in a pattern that was wrong for spontaneous combustion, which begins in the accumulated heat of the hay itself. From above, from inside, spreading outward from the center of the bale mass. This pattern started below and moved up the way a fire moves when it is set at the base of a dry board wall with an accelerant or a carefully placed piece of burning material. Caleb came and stood beside her without a word, reading her attention to the wall. Tell me, he said. She showed him the char pattern with the lantern tracing the movement with a gesture rather than touching the burned wood. Started here. The pattern is wrong for spontaneous combustion. It moved up from the base. He crouched and looked. He touched the edge of the burned board where the burn was deepest and oldest, and she saw in his face the recognition settling, like something that was expected but not wanted. "Someone said it," he said. "I believe so." He stood. He looked north in the direction of the Hatcher property, invisible in the cold dark. The mountains behind it were invisible too. Everything north of the fence line was simply darkness. "Gantry told them where you were," he said. His voice had flattened in the particular way that meant the anger was there but was being run through the same control system he ran everything through. "They know what you likely brought with you, and they're not waiting anymore." "No," she said. "This escalates, Margaret. You need to understand that. They've gone from sending an envoy to burning buildings. The next step is direct." "I know." He looked at her in the lantern light with the assessment that was both professional and not, reading her steadiness, the real state of her behind the steady presentation. "Do you, I spent 11 years managing men who operated outside the law in various capacities," she said. "I know how this terrain works. I know what the escalation pattern looks like." She looked at the burned wall and the ruined hay, the cost of what she had brought into this place. "I'm sorry about the barn." "The barn can be rebuilt," he said. He said it without particular emphasis as a simple fact, and she heard in the simplicity of it the other thing. The thing that had nothing to do with the barn. And she could not respond to it directly because if she did, she would have to respond to all of it. And this was not the moment. She picked up her lantern and walked back to the house in the cold. Eli came to breakfast the next morning with the careful, studied quality of a man who has been thinking about how to be in a room for some time before entering it. He sat down and said he had heard about the barn and that it was bad luck, and Caleb said it was not luck, and that Margaret had found the char pattern, and Eli's eyes moved to her with a sharpness that she did not think was surprise. "You know fire investigation," he said. "I know what spontaneous combustion does not look like," she said. A pause in which something passed between the brothers that was below the surface of the conversation. A current that moved through the silence without being spoken. "You think it's Hatcher," Eli said. "I think it's whoever Hatcher is working with," Caleb said. He set down his coffee and looked at his brother with the direct, undistracted look he used for things that required clarity. "Eli, I need to know where you stand on this." The moment stretched in the way that moments stretch when they are carrying more than their apparent weight. Eli looked at his brother with the blue eyes that were their mother's eyes, not their father's, and something moved in them that she watched carefully. "I stand with the family," he said. "I always have." "Good," Caleb said. "I need you in Montrose. Watch Gantry. Where he goes, who he talks to, whether he sends any telegrams. Report back every 2 days." Eli agreed without argument. He was gone inside an hour, and Margaret watched him ride out and thought about his face in those 3 seconds before he answered. She thought about what Walter had said, "I am less certain of Eli when it comes to Hatcher." She put it in the place where she kept things she was not yet ready to act on, and she went to the office and she opened the notebook, and she worked at the notation system with the patience of a woman who has spent most of her adult life making sense of things that were deliberately obscured, turning the code the way you turn a lock, feeling for the place where the tumblers would yield. On the 3rd page, she found it. A set of initials followed by a name written fully in Thomas's actual handwriting, rather than his shorthand, not abbreviated, not coded, written out in the plain and legible hand of a man who either forgot to obscure it or decided this particular name needed to be unmistakably clear. She looked at it for a long time. The name was Emmett Cross. She stood up. She went to the survey map on the wall. She scanned the margin notations in Walter's pencil until she found it E. Cross, Land Commissioner, cited in a notation from 1885 regarding the original survey certification. Emmett Cross was the man who had certified the disputed survey, who had the power to correct or not correct the boundary error, who sat in the position that made the entire land fraud scheme possible. And Emmett Cross's name was in Thomas's notebook. She went to find Caleb. They spent 3 hours that afternoon with the notebook, the survey records, the land commissioner's correspondence from the 1883 ledger file, and the full 4 years of financial documentation spread between them on the office desk and the floor building. The picture piece by piece with the methodical patience of people who have both learned in different ways that incomplete pictures lead to wrong decisions. The land commissioner's letter, which Margaret had found clipped inside the 1883 ledger and noted as a reference item without examining it closely until now, was from Emmett Cross addressed to Walter Harding, asking about the 1879 survey of the north section in language that was technically neutral but which read now against everything else, had the particular quality of a man performing ignorance of something he was not ignorant of. Emmett Cross had been Montrose County Land Commissioner since 1882. He had access to every survey record in the county. He had the authority to certify corrections or decline to certify them. And he had been in Thomas Hale's notebook since at least 1886, connected to figures and dates and a set of initials, JMH, James Monroe Hatcher, that placed him at the center of a scheme that had been operating for years. The mechanism is straightforward, Caleb said when they had worked through most of it. He had pushed back from the desk and was looking at the assembled documents with the expression of a man who has put together an ugly picture and is giving it its proper name. Cross identifies a survey error, a real one, or possibly one he manufactured in the certification process. He holds it without filing the correction. He sells the information to Hatcher, who buys the land above the north section, knowing the error exists and knowing Cross will activate it on schedule. The plan is to use the legal process to push us out of the north section, buy it distressed, and between Cross's official position and Hatcher's legal resources, make it look entirely above board. And Thomas, Margaret said, Thomas came into it somehow, possibly through one of his gambling contacts who was connected to the money that was funding Hatcher's operation, possibly more directly. What he did with the information was start recording it. Caleb paused. My best reading of this notebook is that Thomas was building leverage. He was going to sell it back or use it to protect himself from the people he owed money to, or some combination of both. He was always looking for the angle, she said, even when there was no angle worth having. When he died, the leverage died with him, as far as Cross and Hatcher knew. He looked at her. Until you walked into Walter's employment ad 3 years later with the documentation in your cedar chest. And Gantry tracked me here. Within a month of your arrival. His jaw was set. Someone was watching the postal forwarding on that employment letter, or watching the Abilene contacts. He looked out the window at the November day. We need to get this to a federal officer. Not a county court, not the Montrose Marshal. Federal. I know. She had worked through this calculation herself. The county commissioner is implicated. The land dispute is in the county system. If I try to get this to a Denver office through normal channels, Cross will know within days. There's a federal circuit marshal in Gunnison, he said. A man named Voss. My father has dealt with him. He's not part of the county commissioner's network. He paused. Getting you there without Gantry following is the problem. The Hill wrote, she said, after dark. He looked at her. That's a hard ride in November in the dark. Yes, she said, but it's the one they won't be watching. I come with you, he said. She started to object. The ranch, the hands, Walter's condition, and he cut it off before she had the words, You're not going alone, Margaret. That is not a negotiation. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, All right. And something shifted in the room very slightly in the direction of something that was not only about Gantry or the notebook or what happened next with the federal marshal. She chose not to name it yet. She had learned over the years to leave certain things in the unspoken until the spoken had a proper foundation. But she was aware of it the way you are aware of a change in the light before you can say with certainty what has changed. Walter's cardiac episode came that same afternoon before they had made any further plans. Rosario found him on the floor of his bedroom at 4 o'clock, and the house changed the instant her voice sounded in the hall. A particular kind of still, purposeful alarm, nothing wasted, nothing performed. Caleb was past Margaret and up the stairs before she had fully registered the sound, and when she reached the doorway, he was already on the floor beside his father, one hand on his father's chest, his voice low and steady. Walter was conscious, pale in a way that was not his normal pallor, but the white of something in the process of deciding which way to go. Caleb was speaking to him with the particular tone, not gentle exactly, but focused in a way that gave the person it was aimed at something to orient toward. And Walter's eyes were open and tracking his son's face. Margaret went for the physician. She rode to Montrose at a pace she had never ridden the road before, and returned with the doctor in 2 hours, which was the best that could be done. And in the intervening time, Rosario had gotten Walter to his bed and had stayed beside him without drama, doing exactly what needed to be done in the steady, comprehensive way that she did everything. The physician spent an hour with Walter and came out with the careful expression of a man delivering a verdict he has practiced delivering. It was a serious episode. Walter was stable. With rest and restriction of activity, he could expect months, possibly considerably more. Without them, considerably less. He said this to Caleb and Eli, who had returned from Montrose by then, and to Margaret because she was there, and Caleb had not moved her out of the room, which was its own kind of statement. Walter from his bed sent for Pete and received the afternoon cattle count, with his eyes closed and his hands folded on the blanket, and then he opened one eye and corrected Pete's memory on the count for the previous Tuesday, and Pete received the correction with the dignity of a man who expected it, and then Walter sent everyone out and slept. Margaret stood in the doorway of the room after everyone else had gone. Caleb was in the chair by the window with the posture of a man who is sitting because his body requires it, and not because he intends to rest. She did not go in. She understood the geography. After a while, he turned his head and found her. "He's going to be all right tonight," she said. "I know." His voice had a roughness in it that was not his usual voice. Tonight, she understood. Tonight was answered. The question was the larger time which no one in this room had sufficient information to answer, and which he was calculating with the sleepless precision of a man who deals in physical realities and who applies the same blunt accuracy to the ones that are not comfortable. She stayed in the doorway. She did not tell him it would be fine because she did not know that, and he would not believe it. She simply stayed at the edge of the room, close enough to be present. It was the most honest thing she could offer, and it seemed from the slight easing of his shoulders to be what was needed. After a long while in the low lamplight, he looked at her again and said, "The night we were in the line shack, when the storm came in." She waited. "I've been thinking about that night since it happened," he said, not in a way I was prepared for. She was very still. "I don't know how to talk about this sort of thing," he said. "I never learned how. Clara and I were... It was easy with Clara. There was no territory to navigate because she came at things directly and I could do the same. And after she died, I decided I didn't have to learn. And now," she said, "now." He looked at his father's face, the white stillness of it in sleep. "Now it seems like a decision I made for reasons that no longer entirely apply." She looked at him in the lamplight for a long moment. She looked at what 12 years of a particular kind of discipline had done to his face, which was to make it very clear and very used and very real with the quality of something that has been doing actual work in actual conditions for a long time. She found she trusted it entirely. "When this is resolved," she said, "I would like to have that conversation. The one you don't know how to have." He looked at her directly with the full steadiness. "So would I," he said. They left it there. Walter slept. The fire in the grate burned down. The night outside the window was clear and very cold, and the stars above the Rocky Mountains were the kind that only come out when the air is perfectly still and the sky has been thoroughly washed. They left for Gunnison at midnight after Walter was settled, and the ranch was quiet, and Pete had been briefed with the minimum information required for him to manage overnight without either of them present. Pete received the briefing with the impassive pragmatism of a man who has been operating on this land for 7 years and has long since stopped being surprised by the decisions made above him in the hierarchy, provided those decisions had a logic he could work with. He shook Caleb's hand. He shook Margaret's hand, which surprised her enough that she felt it in her face before she controlled it. Not that he shook it because she had come to respect Pete and suspected he had come to at least professionally respect her, but the moment of it, the quiet acknowledgement in the grip of a man who had started out looking at her with skepticism and had arrived somewhere else. The hill route was rough but passable in the moonlight, a track used primarily by trapping parties that cut southeast through high scrub before dropping into the Gunnison Valley by a series of switchbacks that required careful navigation in the dark, but that Caleb moved through with the confidence of a man who has walked this ground many times in many conditions. The night was cold with the clean, dry cold of high country, not the wet cold of the plains, but the kind that went through the coat rather than soaking it, and the half-moon gave enough light to see the main features of the track and the shapes of the terrain around it. The horses moved carefully, picking their footing with the deliberate, trusting quality of animals that have been ridden by people who know what they are doing. An hour out, Margaret heard something on the ridge to the north that was not wind and not a night animal, and not the random sounds of the dark. It had rhythm. She raised her hand. They stopped. The sound came again, the particular crack and scrape of a shod hoof on loose shale, the kind of sound that a careful rider cannot entirely suppress on dry rock faces, rhythmic with the rhythm of something moving at a calculated pace rather than grazing or wandering. Two horses, Caleb said very low. Gantry, or someone he sent. He was scanning the ridge above them with the alert stillness of a man reading terrain. They know the hill route. Anyone who knows this country knows it's the back way to Gunnison. Then they'll push ahead to cut us off at the valley drop, she said. He looked at her sideways, a brief, sharp glance that was partly assessment and partly something else. Yes. He turned the gray's head and moved off the track into the scrub oak, pressing back into the shadows of a rock outcropping. Quiet. She followed him into the scrub, and they stood completely still, the horses breathing soft and controlled, and the following sound built in the dark for perhaps 2 minutes, and then stopped, and then resumed, and then stopped again. The pattern of riders who have lost the sound of the horses ahead and are trying to locate them by listening, which only works if the horses ahead are still making sound, which these horses were not. The silence held for 3 minutes. 5. The following sound did not resume. Canyon track, Caleb said, barely audible. 2 miles south, comes out above the stage road below the valley drop. They won't know it. You're certain? I cut timber in that canyon for 2 winters in my 20s. I could walk it dark. Then walk it, she said. They moved south at a careful walk off the main track, entirely navigating through the scrub by the feel of the terrain under the horses' feet and the quality of the darkness, the slightly less dark of open ground versus the entirely dark of stands of trees. Caleb moved without hesitation, choosing the path by memory, and Margaret followed him with a trust that is not sentiment, but the recognition of competence accurately assessed, which she had rarely given anyone in her adult life, and was giving now without difficulty. The canyon was a narrow slot between sandstone walls that groaned in the wind, above them barely wide enough for the horses to move single file, and for a long stretch she could see nothing but the dark shape of Caleb ahead of her and the faint gleam of the half-moon on the canyon rim 40 feet overhead. The walls were close enough that she could have touched both of them from horseback. The sound inside the canyon was amplified and strange, the horses' hoofbeats coming back at them from the rock. The canyon opened onto a shelf of rock that looked down on the stage road 200 feet below, and Caleb found the switchback that dropped them to the road level in 3 long traverses. And then they were on firm ground, moving east with the lights of Gunnison visible in the valley ahead, faint and warm against the dark, and behind them the ridge was silent. She did not exhale entirely until they were half a mile down the road. You did that well, Caleb said. I followed you, she said. You didn't panic. You read the terrain and you moved when we needed to move. He was looking at the road ahead. Not everyone can do that under pressure. I've had practice, she said, managing situations where the wrong response ends badly. He was quiet for a moment. 11 years of it. 11 years of it, she agreed. The road to Gunnison was good and straight, and the horses moved out at a comfortable trot through the cold night, and she thought about Thomas, which she rarely allowed herself to do anymore, and she thought about what it had cost her and what it had made her, and whether the making had been worth the cost. She had arrived at a provisional answer to that question in the months since his death, which was, you did not choose the making, but you could choose what you did with the result. The woman she was now, the woman who could read a char pattern and navigate a canyon in the dark and sit across a desk from a federal marshal and make a clear case, was not the woman Thomas Hale had married. She was the woman who had survived being married to him, which was a different person with different capabilities. She was not sure she would have chosen to be made that way, but she was here riding toward Gunnison in the middle of a November night with the mountains at her back and someone she trusted beside her, and that was not nothing. Marshal Voss was a short, methodical man of about 60 who had been shaving when they arrived at his office at 6 in the morning and received them with the shaving soap still on one jaw and the careful evaluating expression of a man who gets early visitors in his line of work and has learned that early visitors are usually either very important or very drunk and can generally tell which within the first 20 seconds. He was not a man who performed surprise. He looked at the two of them, road-dusty, serious, arriving without announcement before his coffee was made, and he said, "Come in, I'll hear it." He heard it completely. Margaret laid it out, as she had done for Caleb, in order and without embellishment, and she laid the notebook on his desk and the survey discrepancy documentation that Caleb had brought, and the land commissioner's letter, and Voss read it all with the focused attention of a man who has spent 30 years in federal law work and knows what evidence of consequence looks like because he has handled a considerable amount of it and a considerable amount of what is not. When he finished writing, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Emmett Cross," he said. "Yes," Margaret said. "Cross has been land commissioner for 6 years," Voss said. "He certified 3 surveys in this county in the past 4 years alone, and there have been irregularities in 2 of those certifications that we were unable to develop past the circumstantial at the time." He looked at the notebook again. "This is not circumstantial." "No," she said. "I need to go to Denver for the warrants. The county system is compromised. That's 3 days minimum. Possibly 2 if Denver moves fast, which they will if I tell them Cross is involved because they've been watching him." He looked at them both. "Can you keep the ranch secure for 3 days?" "I have 8 men and a foreman who knows every foot of the property," Caleb said. "Yes." "Good." Voss stood. "Mrs. Hale, I need a full written account. How you came to possess the notebook when you understood its significance, every contact you have had with Gantry." She wrote for an hour at Voss's side table while he sent a telegram to Denver, and Caleb read the county newspaper with the focused, unrevealing patience of a man who has been up all night and is not going to let that be visible to anyone. The account was precise and chronological, and she did not editorialize. Voss read it when she finished, made 2 requests for elaboration on specific points that she provided, and then signed the bottom of his copy as a receipt and returned the original. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "I want to be honest with you. What you have brought me is sufficient to initiate federal charges against Cross and potentially against Hatcher, depending on what Denver can develop. The specificity of these records, the dates, the figures, the connection to verifiable county transactions, is exactly the kind of documentation that federal cases are built on." He paused. "Your husband, whatever his intentions in keeping this, created an accurate record. This will do what it needs to do." She nodded once. She did not speak to that particular observation because Thomas Hale doing something that served a useful purpose was not something she had fully come to terms with and was not going to come to terms with in the next 60 seconds in a federal marshal's office. 3 days, she said. 3 days, Voss confirmed. They rode back through the late morning in the full winter light, the mountains ahead of them shifting from blue to white in the low sun, and Margaret was aware in the way she was aware of all changes in the environment around her, of how the quality of the air between them had changed. The crisis was still present. 3 days until the warrants and gantry still in Montrose, and the ranch still sitting between forces that were not done with it. But something in the riding toward rather than the riding away had altered the register. They were halfway back when Caleb said Eli. "Yes," she said, because she had been thinking it since midnight. Eli had come home from Montrose at 10 o'clock the night before, and the horses were being saddled, and while they had not told him they were going to Gunnison, Eli was not a man who missed what was happening in a room. And someone had followed them by the hill route, which was not a route that casual travelers knew. He could have heard it anywhere, Caleb said. Gantry might have had someone watching the barn. He could have, she said. He rode in silence for a while. "I need to talk to him." "I know." She looked at the road ahead, the long straight of it going northwest toward the mountains. "But wait until Voss has the warrants. Once the federal process is moving, the situation changes for everyone involved, and the choices available to Eli change with it. Give him the chance to make the right choice when there is still a right choice to make." He looked at her. "You're protecting him." "I'm giving him time to protect himself." She paused. "I know what it looks like when someone makes a wrong calculation under pressure and doesn't know how to get out of it. I spent 11 years in close proximity to the experience." She kept her eyes on the road. "Sometimes people just need the situation to change before they can change with it." He was quiet for a long moment. The horses walked on through the snow-bright country. "You're kinder than I would be," he said. "I'm practical," she said. "Kindness and practicality come out to the same place more often than people credit." He said nothing to that. But she saw in the corner of her vision his face, the particular configuration of it that she had come to recognize as him encountering something that was going to stay with him. And she found she was glad of it, in the uncomplicated way of a woman who no longer has reason to manage whether she is glad. They reached Silver Creek in the early afternoon, and Caleb went directly to Pete to brief him on the situation and the 3-day timeline, and the increased watch required, and Margaret went to the office and sat down at the desk and opened the ledger to the current reconciliation she had been working on. The numbers were what they were. The operational efficiency of Silver Creek, stripped of the complications that were currently threatening it, was solid. 2 full seasons of properly managed grazing and purchasing and maintenance would bring the ranch into sustained profitability. The land, the full 1,400 acres plus the north section that was currently disputed, was good land. The cattle were good, the horses were good, the men were capable and knew the country. Walter had built something worth protecting. She was protecting it. She worked through the afternoon until Rosario called her for supper, and at supper it was the 3 of them again. Caleb, Margaret, Walter, who had come down from his room with the deliberate care of a man who intends to show up for his own life as long as it is in any way possible to do so. Walter looked at her across the table with the dark, sharp eyes that missed nothing, and then he looked at his son, and then he looked back at his soup. "Well," he said, "I expect you'll tell me what happened when it's time to tell me." 3 days, Caleb said. Walter nodded. He ate his soup. He talked for 20 minutes about the beef market and the spring calving schedule, and a hand who had shown interest in staying through another season, which would be good for the operation. He went back upstairs with Rosario's assistance at 8 o'clock. At the doorway, he paused and looked back at Margaret. "You look well," he said. "Better than when you arrived." She considered this. "I suppose I am," she said. He smiled, the rare full smile that rearranged his whole face into something younger and warmer than his usual expression. "Colorado suits some people," he said. "I'm glad you're one of them." He went upstairs. She heard his careful steps on the stairs and then the close of his door, and the house settled around her into the particular quiet of an autumn evening on a working ranch, the fire in the kitchen grate, and the wind outside, and the distant sound of cattle in the near pen. She went to the office. She worked until late. She was aware through the closed door of Caleb moving through the house on his late-night round, checking the doors, banking the fires, and of him pausing outside the office door for a moment before moving on. She did not call out. He did not knock. But the pause was there, and she sat with it, and it was enough. Voss arrived with 2 deputies on the second day, not the third. The Denver office had moved faster than expected. Cross had been on their list for 2 years, Voss explained, standing in the kitchen with his coat still on, and the cold morning air around him, and the documentation Margaret had provided was the kind of specific, verifiable evidence that transformed a circumstantial file into an actionable case. The warrants were comprehensive and had been signed by a federal judge in Denver who Voss said had a particular interest in land fraud cases, given what had happened in the southern part of the territory over the previous decade. He sat down and drank Rosario's coffee, which was better than his own, and told them what would happen in the next 24 hours. Cross would be arrested at his office in Montrose. Hatcher would be arrested at his property. Gantry would be picked up at the Crawford Hotel, along with any documentation that could be found in his room. "And Cord Fraley?" Margaret asked. Voss looked at her over his coffee cup. "The double informant situation is interesting," he said. "Fraley has been on 2 payrolls since before he went to work for Hatcher. Your husband's original employer, the gambling network in Kansas City that Gantry represents, had him placed at Hatcher's operation before the scheme was fully operational, which means his information to you, Mr. Harding, was shaped by 2 competing principles. Some of it was real," Caleb said. "The information about Hatcher's legal strategy was accurate. And some of it was managed," Margaret said. "The parts designed to keep you watching the legal process rather than the financial records." Voss set down his coffee. "Smart woman," he said. It was directed at Caleb rather than Margaret, which was the convention of the time, and which she did not bother being irritated by. She understood he meant it as a compliment. "I know," Caleb said without looking up from the table. The deputies left with Voss within the hour. The arrests moved through the afternoon with the systematic efficiency of a federal operation that is planned carefully and has the warrants to back up the planning. Cross was found in his office seated at his desk and made no immediate resistance, which Voss later described as the behavior of a man who had been expecting this day for some time. Hatcher was found at his property in the process of having the contents of his office loaded onto a freight wagon, which was the behavior of a man who had received some advance warning. The advance warning, when it was traced, had come from a rider dispatched from Montrose the previous evening. The rider's description matched Eli Harding's horse. Caleb went to Eli's room in the evening after the deputies had brought back their reports. Margaret was in the office when she heard their voices through the wall. Not the words, but the register, Caleb's even and low, Eli's initially elevated and then gradually quietening. She worked at the ledger and did not try to hear. Eli came to find her the next morning in the barn, where she was checking the progress on a bay gelding's healing foreleg cut. He came in from the barn door, and she turned and found him standing in the aisle with his hat in his hands, and the look of a man who has been up most of the night thinking about himself clearly and has not enjoyed the experience. "I didn't tell Gantry you were going to Gunnison," he said. She waited. "I told a contact in town, a man who works as a land agent. I gave him information about what you had found in the books and my belief about what was in that notebook because I thought—" He stopped and looked at his hat and then at her. "I was trying to prevent this from getting worse. Hatcher had approached me 6 months ago about the land deal. He told me the claim was solid and that the family would be better served by negotiating an out-of-court settlement for the North section than by fighting it. I thought he was right. I thought the evidence he showed me supported the claim. Did you tell Caleb?" "No." He looked at the floor. "I told myself it was protecting the family from a fight they couldn't win. I told myself I was being practical." He shook his head. "I told myself a lot of things." "You were being managed," she said, not unkindly. "Hatcher gave you the version of the evidence that supported the conclusion he wanted you to reach." "I know that now." He met her eyes. "I didn't tell Gantry directly about Gunnison, but I told the land agent enough that when the pieces came together, someone made the connection and sent a rider." He paused. "Hatcher got away with part of what he was taking." "He'll be found," she said. "Once a federal warrant is issued and the land is frozen, there's not much to take." He was quiet for a moment. "Then thank you for telling me to wait. Before all this, I think I needed the situation to change before I could see it clearly." "I know," she said. He looked at her with the genuine, complicated warmth that was his real quality underneath the performance, the thing he was when he was not managing himself toward an audience. "He hasn't been happy," he said. "Caleb, in a long time. He's been everything he's supposed to be, everything the ranch needs, but not happy." He put his hat back on. "I wanted you to know that, since it looks like you might have something to do with the situation changing." She looked at him. He was not performing now. He was just Eli standing in a horse barn in the morning light, saying something he meant without the usual scaffolding around it. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. He touched his hat brim and walked out of the barn into the winter morning, and she turned back to the gelding's foreleg, and she was careful about her expression, and she was aware that she was doing something she had not done in a very long time, which was to allow herself in the quiet of a working barn with the smell of horses and hay and leather around her to be simply glad. Walter came downstairs the morning after the arrests and sat at the breakfast table and listened to the full account which Caleb gave him in the same plain way that ran in the family, and Walter listened to all of it without interrupting. When Caleb was done, Walter sat for a moment with his coffee and the careful expression of a man assembling something. "I knew Cross was connected to Hatcher," he said. Caleb looked at him. "I didn't know the mechanism, but Fraley told me 8 months ago that Cross had certified Hatcher's purchase knowing about the survey error, and I began to understand the shape of it." He paused. "What I didn't have was the documentation. The documentation that—" he looked at Margaret, "that Thomas Hale was carrying without knowing who would eventually use it." "He might have known," she said. "He was not unintelligent about leverage." "No," Walter said. "Perhaps not." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I had a conversation with a federal land surveyor in September before you arrived. I asked him theoretically about the process for challenging a fraudulent survey certification. He told me I would need documentation of the original corrupt transaction, not merely testimony, that the federal court's standard was very high for cases involving sitting county officials." He looked at Margaret again. "And then your letter arrived, forwarded from Abilene. And I thought—" "You thought she might have it," Caleb said. "I thought it was possible. Given what I knew about Thomas Hale's activities and his connection to certain financial networks in the territory, I thought it was possible she might have something." He set down his coffee. "I am not entirely without fault in this, Margaret. I hired you because I needed a ranch manager. That was entirely real. But I also hired you because I thought you might bring the evidence I needed. I should have told you that from the start." The table was quiet for a moment. Outside, the November light was flat and clear and very bright on the snow. "You should have," she said. "Yes." He looked at her steadily with the eyes that were always clear. I am sorry. She looked back at him for a moment. Then the work needed to be done regardless. The books were what you said they were. She picked up her coffee. But if you find yourself with another such scheme in mind, I would appreciate being in the conversation from the beginning. Something moved in Walter's face that was partly relief and partly admiration. Agreed, he said. He looked at his son. She's quite something. I know, Caleb said, and he did not look at her when he said it, which was more informative than if he had. The federal proceedings moved through the winter months in the deliberate, incremental way of legal processes that have solid evidence but must work through proper channels regardless. Margaret was deposed twice before Christmas, giving her testimony with the clear, unhedged precision that the federal attorney noted approvingly in his correspondence with Voss. Cross entered a guilty plea in January on the land fraud charges to avoid the additional corruption counts, which was the behavior of a man who knew the full evidence and understood the mathematics of his situation. Hatcher's operation, once the land claims were frozen, pending federal review, went into creditors' proceedings with the speed of a structure that had been held up primarily by the expected acquisition of Silver Creek's north section and collapsed without it. The north section, which Walter had been quietly preparing to donate to the county as a right-of-way since September, a legal maneuver that would make Hatcher's claim entirely moot regardless of the court outcome, was formally transferred in February. Walter's attorney in Denver called it the most elegant land case resolution he had seen in 15 years of frontier property law, which Margaret suspected had something to do with Walter having planned it for considerably longer than anyone had known. You had this planned before I arrived, she said to him one morning when he was propped in his bed with the financial reports and the sound of February wind at the window. I had the outline, he said. The details required the documentation you brought. And if I hadn't had it, then I would have had a harder winter, he said. He looked at her. But I think you would have stayed anyway. For other reasons. She did not answer that. She read him the quarterly summary instead, and he listened, and they both understood without discussion that the quarterly summary was not the only thing being accounted for. 2 weeks after the arrest, when the federal proceedings were settled into their groove and the ranch had returned to the operational rhythm that was its natural state, Caleb came to find her in the south pasture on a Wednesday afternoon. She was on Juniper checking the grass recovery on the sections that had been rested through the fall, and she heard the gray's hoofbeats and turned. He rode up and stopped beside her and looked at the pasture with her for a moment, reading the grass condition with the same professional attention she was giving it. Recovery's good, he said. Better than I projected, she said. The rest period and the snowfall helped. I'm going to revise the spring grazing plan. We can probably open this section 3 weeks earlier than I originally thought. Good. He looked at the mountains, which were in the late afternoon arrangement she had come to regard as their best. The shadows running long and blue up the flanks, and the upper snowfields in full light, everything in depth and dimension. He said nothing for a while. She waited because she had learned that Caleb's silences were not empty and did not require filling. Walter told me something this morning, he said. He told me that he knew when he forwarded that employment letter to you in Abilene that he was betting on more than your bookkeeping. He paused. He said he had a conversation with a man in Denver who had known Thomas Hale, and the man told him Thomas's widow had managed his affairs for 11 years with a quality that was in his exact words remarkable. He said remarkable. Walter said he decided remarkable was exactly what Silver Creek needed. Margaret considered this. The late afternoon light was warm on the dead grass of the pasture, and Juniper stood easy beneath her. And the other thing, she said, the thing he hoped I might be carrying. He knew there was a possibility. He didn't know certainly. He said if the documentation was there, good. If it wasn't, the ranch still needed what you had. He was planning it before I arrived, she said. The survey transfer, the right-of-way donation. He's been planning it for 2 years, Caleb said. He just needed one more piece. He looked at her sideways. He said, I thought if she turned out to be what I hoped, Caleb might finally have reason to pay attention to something that matters. She was still for a moment. Then, he said that. He said that. The tone was the dry one he used when something was both absurd and entirely accurate. My father has never been subtle when it suited him. She looked at the mountains and then at Caleb at the angles of his face in the late light, and she found she had nothing to object to in what Walter had done. Not the strategy, not the hope it had contained. A man who builds something for 40 years learns to recognize what will hold it up when he is gone. He was right, she said. Caleb looked at her. The steadiness of his gaze had over the months taken on a quality she recognized as something beyond the professional. Not different in its nature because he looked at everything with the same quality of complete attention, but carrying a different weight in it, the particular weight of attention that has become personal rather than observational. He generally is, Caleb said. It's irritating. She laughed, which was a thing she did more easily now than she had when she arrived, and he looked at her with an expression that was brief and entirely private, and they turned the horses toward home through the late afternoon light. Walter died on a Thursday in February, which was the kind of day he would have approved of for the purpose. Clear and cold, the mountains sharp against a sky so blue it looked painted, and the ranch going about its work in the yard below his window, with the unhurried competence of an operation that knew what it was doing. It was not sudden, and it was not unexpected, and it was not in the end a hard death. He had time to be in the condition he wanted to be in. Things arranged, things said, the account as balanced as it was going to get. He had asked Margaret 2 weeks before to read him the final quarterly summary she had prepared, not the details but the story of it, and she had read it to him with the clear, plain delivery he had always responded to, and he had listened with his eyes closed and his hands folded on the blanket, and a small sound when she was done that she had interpreted as satisfaction. He died with Caleb on one side and Eli on the other, and Rosario at the foot of the bed, and Margaret was in the hallway because this was a family moment, and she understood the geography of family moments without needing to be told. She was part of the household, and she was not yet entirely part of the family, and the distinction mattered in this particular kind of moment. When Caleb came out of the room, he sat down in the hallway beside her without preamble, the way he did everything, directly without performance. She handed him the cup of coffee she had made, and which had gone cold, and he held it in both hands without drinking it. They sat for a long time in the hallway, with the quiet of the house around them and the particular silence of after which has its own density and texture and is different from all other silences. He left the north section to the county, Caleb said eventually. His voice was rougher than usual, not broken, but used like a tool that has been doing hard work. The disputed 600 acres, a right-of-way donation which makes the land claim legally moot regardless of the federal proceedings. He had the papers drawn up in December. He paused. He'd been planning it since September. He was very patient, Margaret said. He was always very patient, a sound that was the outline of a laugh without the weight for it. He also left you a third of the operational ranch. Not the land, the cattle operation, the equipment, the accounts receivable. A full operating partner's share. He paused. He told me in December that it was the most financially sound decision he had made in 40 years. He was right about the financial reasoning, she said. He was right about other things, too. The hallway was quiet. The window at the far end let in the February light in a long, cold stripe across the floor, and the sound of the ranch outside was the sound of everything continuing, which was the way things were supposed to go. I've been trying to figure out how to say something, Caleb said. He was looking at the wall across from him, the survey maps and photographs that had been there for decades. For a couple of months now, since the line shack, if I'm honest. She waited. I'm not a man who talks about himself easily, he said. Clara understood that and worked around it. Most people work around it. I've been aware for a long time that it's a limitation, and I've chosen not to regard it as one because it was convenient not to. He turned the cold coffee cup in his hands. You don't work around it. You just look at me, and I find I have to say the thing or be dishonest, and I dislike being dishonest. What's the thing, she said. He looked at her, then turned fully in the dim hallway light with the directness that was the realest thing about him. Unguarded, unmanaged, the bare fact of a man looking at something that matters. 12 years ago, I decided not consciously, but in the way you decide things that are too large for conscious decision, that I was done. Done with the part of life that required you to want something that could be taken away. He said it steadily without self-pity in the matter-of-fact way he said hard things. The ranch I could always replace in a sense. It's land and work, and I understand both. But the rest of it, I decided I was done with the rest of it because the cost was not something I could afford twice. And now, she said, now I've spent 4 months working next to someone who finds the hairline crack in the trough seam and fixes the rotation and rides out in the dark with a federal notebook and doesn't tell me I'm allowed to grieve. He paused. And I find that the decision I made 12 years ago was made by a younger version of myself who was not in full possession of the relevant information. She looked at him in the February light, at the face that was entirely known to her now, the scar along the jaw, the gray in the hair, the eyes that were always steady and always seeing. And she thought about the fortress she had built in herself over the years, and the particular way those walls had been coming down. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow, deliberate way that things come down when they are no longer necessary. "I want you to stay," he said. It came out with the simplicity of something that has been held for a long time and is finally being set down in the right place. Not because the ranch needs you, though it does. Not because my father wanted it, though he did. I want you to stay because you are the clearest thing in my life. And I have not had a clear thing in 12 years, and I find that I am not willing to let it go. She sat with this for a moment in the morning light. "Then I'll stay," she said. She took his hand. She had done it once before briefly in the darkness of the line shack during the storm, his hand finding hers on the arm of the chair. This was different. Deliberate, full her palm flat against the calloused palm of a man who works hard with his hands. The warmth of it going through her with the particular quality of warmth that is not just temperature, but contact, the real physical fact of another person against your skin. He held her hand in both of his and looked at it as though it were something he intended to remember precisely. They sat in the hallway through the morning while the house came back to itself around them, and eventually Rosario brought fresh coffee, and the day began again. The spring came to the Rockies the way spring comes there. Not gently, not all at once, but in fits and arguments with the winter that occasionally looked like the winter was winning, until suddenly one morning you looked out and the snow was retreating up the mountain slopes with something like purpose, and the creek was running fast and loud with the snow melt, and the south-facing pastures were showing the first tentative green beneath the brown of last year's growth. The proceedings in Denver moved through their proper channels through the winter. Cross's guilty plea was entered, and sentencing was scheduled for April. Hatcher's case was more complex. His attorneys were from Denver, and they worked the complications with professional thoroughness. But the land claim was frozen, and the North Section transfer was completed, and the foundation of the scheme was gone, regardless of what the courts eventually found about Hatcher's individual liability. Cord Fraley cooperated with the federal investigators and received a reduced finding that Margaret thought was possibly less than he had earned, with 11 months of double dealing, and possibly more than he deserved given the fire and the general campaign of pressure against the ranch. She felt no strong emotion about it either way. She felt most strongly about the settlement of things and the silence on the other side of them. She was deposed for the final time in March. She gave her testimony in a federal courtroom in Gunnison with the clear, composed delivery she had developed over a lifetime of presenting difficult information in rooms where difficult information was not welcome. And the federal attorney told her afterward in the hallway outside that she was the finest witness he had worked with in his career. And she thanked him and went to find Caleb, who was waiting with the horses. She went to Walter's grave on a Sunday morning in April alone, with the first real warmth of the season coming down off the mountains and the wildflowers beginning along the creek bank. She stood there for a while in the young spring light and thought about what he had done and how he had done it and what it had cost and what it had made. He had hired her for 2 reasons, both of them real. He had needed a ranch manager, and she had been the right person for the job. He had also needed the documentation she had unknowingly carried into his employment, and he had recognized the possibility and bet on it. She had thought for a while that the second reason made the first one instrumental, and that being hired for strategic reasons alongside genuine ones was a form of manipulation she should be more bothered by. She was not, she found, particularly bothered by it. Walter had been a man who understood that good decisions accomplish several things at once, and who had spent his life building operations in which everything served a purpose. She was useful. She had also been needed in a way that went beyond the useful. He had seen both things clearly, and he had made his bet, and he had been right on all counts. She picked a few of the wildflowers from the creek bank and put them at the base of the stone marker and stood for another moment in the morning light. "You were right about the financial reasoning," she said to the marker, "and the rest of it." The wind came down off the mountains, warm and young, carrying the smell of the snowmelt in the coming season. She walked back to the ranch house. Eli's woman was named Clara, which had made Rosario go very still and careful when she first heard it, and which had made Caleb look at the sky for a long moment before he came back to himself and shook Eli's hand and said it was a fine name. Her full name was Clara Ann Mercer, and she was the cousin of the physician's wife, and had come to Montrose from Illinois the previous fall to work as a schoolteacher. And she had the quality, which Margaret observed with the particular attention she gave to people she was trying to accurately assess, of a woman who was genuinely interested in the people around her rather than performing interest. She did not try to navigate Eli. She appeared instead to simply like him, which was a different approach, in which Eli, who had spent 42 years being managed and navigated and charmingly accommodated, did not entirely know what to do with. The not knowing what to do with it was good for him. Margaret had said as much to Caleb, who had looked at his brother at supper one evening, with the expression of a man watching a familiar landscape rearrange itself, and said, "She's good for him, I think." "Rosario likes her," Margaret said. "That settles it," Caleb said, which was not quite a joke. The wedding was in June in the yard of Silver Creek Ranch on a Saturday morning when the sky was the particular clear blue of Colorado summer and the mountains behind the ranch were fully green to their lower flanks and white above that, and the whole of the valley was in its best seasonal presentation, the kind of morning that looked, as Pete said to no one in particular, like someone had ordered it. Pete stood up with Caleb, which Caleb had asked him to do in the direct, unceremonious way he asked for things that mattered to him, plainly and without elaborate explanation of the reason which Pete had received with equal plainness and accepted. Rosario stood with Margaret, which was not a question that had required asking, only a question of which of them acknowledged it first, and it was Rosario who had brought it up one evening in the kitchen in early May, saying simply, "For the wedding, I will stand with you." And Margaret had said, "I know, thank you." And they had gone back to what they were doing. Eli was in the front row with Clara, and the look on his face, open and warm and unreserved in a way that was different from his usual warmth, which had always had an element of performance in it, was one of the things Margaret looked at when she looked out at the small gathering from her position beside the minister. The hands were there in their good clothes, looking cleaned and slightly uncomfortable in the way of men who are in good clothes. Sutter was there with his back straightened as much as he could manage. The physician and his wife were there. A neighbor couple from the Southern Valley, the Devereaux family, who had been friendly with Walter. The minister read from the ceremony. Margaret looked at Caleb, who was looking at her with the same steady directness he brought to everything that mattered. And she thought about the Tuesday in October, when she had burned the promissory note, and the letter had arrived, and about the road south from the main stage road, and the split cottonwood with the white X, and about the sorrel mare named Juniper, and the line shack in the blizzard, and the cold lantern light on a burned wall, and the 3-hour ride through the dark to a marshal who had shaving soap on one jaw, and who had looked at the notebook and said, "This will do what it needs to do." She thought about Thomas, because you could not stand in a moment like this one without allowing a thought for the full account of how you arrived here, and she thought of him without the bitterness that had hardened and then over the past year dissolved like ice in a spring stream, leaving only the factual residue of what had been and what it had made. He had been a man of considerable charm and no reliable north, and he had cost her more than she should have let him cost her. And in the end, the thing he had held without understanding its value had done its work. And here she was in the Colorado morning. "I will," she said when the moment required it. "I will," Caleb said when it was his moment. The minister pronounced them. Pete let a brief, genuine sound from the hands that was more than polite. Rosario's face had the expression it had when she was most moved, which was a slight stiffening around the eyes rather than tears, because Rosario's emotional architecture was similar to the ranch house. Solid stone that did not flex but that held its heat well. Eli caught Margaret's eye over the small crowd and smiled. The real smile, the unperformed one she had seen on the morning of his confession in the barn, and she smiled back with the directness she gave everything that deserved it, and that was that. The afternoon of the wedding, after the guests had gone, and the hands had been fed, and Rosario had achieved the particular satisfied exhaustion of a woman who has prepared a large meal flawlessly and knows it. Margaret stood on the porch in the long summer evening, watching the mountains turn from gold to rose to the particular purple that the Rockies went at dusk, and listened to the creek below the hill, and the horses in the south pasture, and the wind in the cottonwoods. Caleb came out and stood beside her. He did not take her hand or put his arm around her or say anything for a long while, because he was a man who understood that some moments did not require augmentation. The last of the light left the peaks. The valley went blue, and then the particular deep violet of high country summer, dark, the stars coming on one at a time, and then all at once. I keep thinking, she said, about that Tuesday in October. When you arrived, when I burned the note, that morning. She looked at the dark mountains. I thought I was closing something, finishing the last of it. Instead, it was the first step of a very long road I hadn't seen yet. He was quiet for a moment. And the road brought you here. Yes. She turned and looked at him, at his face in the dusk. The known lines of it, the steadiness that was so thoroughly itself that she had never quite been able to see around it, to whatever was more private underneath, and had come instead to understand that this was not a wall, but simply his actual self, as clear as any self she had known. Here is good, she said. Yes, he said. He put his arm around her, which was the entirely sufficient answer to everything, and she leaned into the warm solidity of him and looked at the stars above the Rocky Mountains. Below them, Silver Creek ran on in the dark, fast with the summer snowmelt, saying what water says in mountain country. The same thing over and over, steady and indifferent and permanent, the sound of something that will be here long after all the human business of the valley is finished and settled, and the names on the markers are illegible with age. She listened to it. She stayed. The operations of Silver Creek in the season that followed had the quality of things that have found their right arrangement. Margaret revised the grazing rotation through the spring and completed the full 4-year ledger reconciliation she had been working on since October, producing a financial picture that was clean and accurate for the first time in Walter's own recollection. She implemented the volume purchasing agreements with the Gunnison feed merchants that reduced the annual feed cost by 14%. She revised the payroll system and found in doing so that 2 of the 8 hands had been underpaid relative to their actual job duties for at least 2 years, which she corrected retroactively from the operational budget with Caleb's immediate agreement and Pete's quietly satisfied acknowledgement. She also in the spring hired 2 additional hands to work the north section, which was coming back into full rotation with the genuine enthusiasm of land that has been underused and has more to give. The spring calving on the north section went well. The water levels were high with the snowmelt, and the creek ran fast past its banks into the supplementary irrigation channels she had designed over the winter. The grass came in with the particular vigorous abundance of high country range in a good spring, and the herd moved through it with the unhurried contentment of cattle that have enough. Sutter's back recovered sufficiently by April that he could manage the trough checks himself again. But Margaret continued to walk them 3 mornings a week because the information was useful, and because the early mornings on the ranch, the particular quality of the light before 6, the cold air going warm, the mountains going from dark shapes to fully lit presence as the sun cleared the east ridge, had become one of the things she would not willingly give up. Caleb still left the lantern lit on the porch hook when he went out for his early rounds. She had said nothing about it when he did it. She had said nothing about it when they were married, and the habit continued. It seemed like the right kind of thing to not comment on. The first summer together had the quality of a season that is simultaneously entirely ordinary and exactly what was needed. They worked the ranch together with the comfortable operational fluency of 2 people who have been working beside each other long enough to move without collision, who know each other's timing and capacity, and working style with the thoroughness that only comes from months of daily proximity and mutual attention. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes, that he woke quiet rather than dramatic from them, and sat at the window for a while and came back to bed without discussion. She learned that he had a particular difficulty with decisions that involved selling cattle he had raised from calves, a sentimentality he acknowledged readily and without embarrassment as the one place where his practical nature ran up against something that refused to be practical. She learned that he could fix nearly anything mechanical with a combination of observation and patience that she found genuinely admirable, and that he had a complete inability to ask for help on mechanical things, even when the help would make the repair take 40 minutes rather than 3 hours. She told him this. He looked at the fence post he was currently in the process of resetting with tools that were not quite right for the job and said, "I'll get there." "In another hour," she said. "Probably." She went to the barn and got the tool that would have made the work take 20 minutes and brought it back and set it in front of him without comment and went back to what she had been doing. A while later, she heard the fence post going in quick and right, and she allowed herself a brief private satisfaction that she kept off her face. He noticed it anyway. He always noticed. "Thank you," he said that evening. "You're welcome," she said. That was the geometry of it. Not drama, not performance, not the elaborate management of two people who are working around each other's difficult corners. Simply two people doing the work and being honest about what it required and getting it done. She had not known this was possible at 42 years old, in a life that had contained mostly the other kind. She had not believed she would learn it late. She was glad to have been wrong. There were orphans from the mining settlements to the west, three of them found by the Gunnison Circuit pastor in April, when a mining camp above the valley collapsed in a spring slide and left 7 dead and various survivors, including these 3 children, without clear family to go to. The pastor had brought them to Montrose and asked around. Margaret had heard of it from the physician's wife and had gone to Caleb the same evening. "I want to bring them here," she said, "if you agree." He looked at her. "Tell me about them." She told him what she knew: 2 boys ages 9 and 11 and a girl of 7. The boys' names were Samuel and Henry. The girl's name was not yet known. She had not spoken since the slide. Caleb looked at the survey map for a while. "The bunkhouse has a room that's been sitting empty since Jenkins left," he said. "I thought a room in the main house would be better," she said. "For the girl, at least." He nodded once. "All right. You don't want to discuss it further." He looked at her. "What would I want to discuss?" She looked back at him. She had prepared arguments, anticipated objections, assembled the practical case for it. She had not prepared for the absence of any of that. "Nothing," she said. "I'll contact the pastor tomorrow." The children arrived on a Thursday in May. Samuel and Henry were wary and self-contained in the way of children who have recently had reason to become so, and they followed Caleb to the barn with the careful, watchful attention of people assessing whether an environment is safe, which it was, and which they worked out at their own pace over the following weeks. The girl, who did not speak for 3 weeks and then said her name was Alice, attached herself to Rosario immediately, and to Margaret within a month, with the particular wordless tenacity of a child who has found the adult she intends to rely on and is not inclined to negotiate about it. Pete received the children with the impassive pragmatism that was his response to most developments, and within 2 weeks had assigned Samuel a task in the stables that was real rather than invented, and which Samuel performed with the seriousness of a boy who understands that being given a real task is a form of respect. Henry, who was the older and more watchful of the two, took longer. He came to Caleb one Saturday morning with a question about the mechanics of the hay press in the barn, a question so specific that it required a real answer rather than a simple one. And Caleb gave it to him and then showed him the next 3 steps. And Henry asked 3 more questions, each of them more specific than the last. And this continued for an hour, and afterward Henry began appearing in the barn at the times when Caleb was there. Alice learned to walk the trough line with Margaret in the early mornings. She was quiet company, not because she lacked things to say, which she did not. She made that clear once she began speaking again, but because she understood the quality of the early morning and did not want to disturb it. She had, at 7 years old, the instinct for what a thing required that Margaret associated with a particular kind of intelligence, and she let it be for now, without naming it, which seemed like the right approach. Caleb watched all 3 of them. Margaret watched him watch them and did not say anything about what she saw in his face because some things did not require commentary, and this was one of them. 12 years of a particular kind of grief, and the 3 children who were now in his barn and his kitchen and his house, asking questions about hay presses and walking trough lines and sitting at his kitchen table drawing pictures of horses. Some things resolved themselves given enough time and the right ground. The October of the following year brought the 2nd anniversary of the day Margaret had driven down the road past the split cottonwood with the white X and seen Silver Creek Ranch for the first time in the afternoon light. She had not planned to mark the occasion, but she found herself on that particular afternoon on Juniper at the top of the rise where she had first stopped and looked. The ranch below her was the same ranch it had been then, the same stone house, the same weathered red barn, the same configuration of pens and sheds and bunkhouse. The barn's east wall was new, rebuilt in the spring after the fire, and the new wood stood out slightly lighter than the weathered old boards around it, but it was solid. The north section was in full rotation, the cattle visible there in the late afternoon light. There was a 3rd horse in the near pen that had not been there before, a gentle gray gelding that Samuel had claimed as his own project with Caleb's guidance, and was in the process of training in the methodical, patient way that Caleb had shown him. She could see Caleb himself in the yard below, talking with Pete, both men standing in the easy posture of men who have worked together for years and trust each other's judgment on the matter at hand. She could see Rosario at the kitchen window. She could see Alice sitting on the porch steps with a book. And at this distance, she could not make out the title, but she could see that the child was reading with the absorbed, complete inward attention of a person who had found what reading was for. She sat on Juniper for a while and looked at it. She had left Abilene in October of the previous year with a dismantled household, a difficult history, and a cedar chest containing a flour sack, containing a notebook she did not yet know how to use. She had driven west through the mountains with the particular resigned courage of a woman who has run out of better options and has decided to make the available option into something worth having. She had not expected this. She had not known to expect it. A woman who expects very little and keeps her accounts current and pays attention to what is actually in front of her and does the work that needs doing day after day in the cold and the ordinary and the crisis. That woman she had always believed did not get to have this particular kind of autumn afternoon. She had been wrong about that. The sun moved behind the peaks and the valley went into the long shadow that preceded dusk. Below her, Caleb looked up from his conversation with Pete and found her on the rise without apparently having to look very hard. He raised one hand in the brief, economical greeting he reserved for moments when words would cover the same ground less efficiently. She raised a hand in return. She turned Juniper and rode down toward the ranch toward the smell of Rosario's supper, coming through the kitchen window, and the sound of the creek running, and the boy in the near pen working his gray gelding through a simple figure of 8, with the patient repeating care of someone learning what it takes, and Caleb walking up through the yard to meet her. The mountains behind Silver Creek were exactly as they had always been. Permanent, indifferent, magnificent. They would be there long after everything else in the valley had changed so completely as to be unrecognizable, and that particular quality, the unchanging permanence of very large things, was she thought less like a reminder of human smallness than like a standard. Here is what endurance looks like at the scale where duration has no particular meaning because it simply is. She rode in through the gate. She was home.